The sound of silver striking crystal cut through the low hum of conversation. It was Christmas Eve in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. 27 guests sat around a sprawling mahogany table. The room smelled of roasted pine and expensive red wine. My mother, Brenda, stood at the head of the table. She wore a silk emerald blouse. She held her wine glass aloft. Her smile was bright and practiced. "To family," she said. Her voice carried the cadence of a seasoned hostess. "We are so blessed this year, especially when we look at our girls." She gestured to my left. My older sister, Harper, sat stiffly in her chair. She wore a tight smile and a designer dress she could not afford. "One daughter," my mother announced, her eyes swept the room to ensure everyone was paying attention, "is a doctor." Polite applause rippled through the guests. Harper nodded. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her linen napkin. Then my mother turned her gaze to me. I stood near the swinging kitchen door. I wore a plain black catering apron over my clothes. I held a heavy silver tray of untouched appetizers. "And the other?" "Well, the other is a maid, but at least our floors are spotless." The laughter did not start all at once. It trickled out from my father, Thomas, sitting at the opposite end of the table. Then it spread to the local councilmen, then the developers, until the entire room joined in. It was a light, refined sound, the kind of laughter reserved for private country clubs and gated driveways. I felt a small tug on the hem of my black apron. I looked down. My 6-year-old son, Leo, stood beside my leg. He had been promised a slice of pie if he stayed quiet in the kitchen, but the noise had drawn him out. He looked up at me. His brow was furrowed. His voice was barely a whisper beneath the laughter of 27 wealthy strangers. "Mommy," he asked, "is being a maid bad?" I did not flush. I did not drop the tray. I placed my hand on the back of Leo's head. I smoothed his hair. I looked across the sea of amused faces. I looked past my father's smug grin. I looked past Harper's averted eyes. My gaze landed on a man sitting quietly near the center of the table, Julian Sterling. He did not live in Wyoming year-round. He was a tech developer looking to carve an eco-resort out of the mountainside. My father had spent the last 6 months practically begging for Julian's attention. He staged this entire dinner just to get him in the room. Julian was not laughing. He held his water glass halfway to his mouth, his sharp eyes locked directly on mine. For a fraction of a second, nobody else breathing in that room existed. Julian tilted his chin down, a microscopic, deliberate nod, a silent acknowledgement between two people who knew a truth the rest of the table was entirely blind to. If you are listening to this right now, maybe you know what it feels like to be the punchline at your own family dinner table. Maybe you know what it is like to shrink yourself so others can feel tall. Welcome to Pana Vengeance. Let me know in the comments how old you are and where you are listening from today. I stayed quiet for a long time. I let them write my story. But I am sharing this because the moment you stop accepting the script they hand you, the whole theater burns down. To understand how a black catering apron brought a Wyoming social dynasty to its knees, you need to understand the Phillips family. We grew up on a sprawling property just outside Jackson. 5,000 square feet of stone and glass designed to intimidate. My mother, Brenda, spent her days managing charity galas and climbing the local social ladder. She believed your worth was measured by your zip code and the letters after your name. My father, Thomas, owned a string of commercial hardware supply stores. He loved shaking hands and slapping backs. He built his entire identity around being the most respected man in the room. And then there was Harper, Dr. Harper Phillips Lawson, 32 years old, board-certified pediatrician. She married Derek, a wealth manager with sandy blonde hair who drove a leased Porsche and wore watches that cost more than my car. My parents worshipped Harper. Their mantle was a shrine to her medical degree, her wedding, her perfect life. I was the footnote, Anaya, the one who did not go to medical school, the one who moved away, tried to build a life out of state, and failed. 4 years before that clinking glass, there was no mahogany table for me. There was only the biting Wyoming wind. It was a Tuesday in late November. The temperature hovered at 14 degrees. I stood in my parents' circular driveway, holding a canvas duffel bag in one hand and a shivering 2-year-old Leo in the other. I had driven 8 hours straight. I was fleeing a relationship that left my bank account at zero and my pride in tatters. My boots crunched against the ice as I walked up the stone steps and rang the doorbell. The heavy oak door swung open. My father, Thomas, stood in the warmth of the foyer. He did not reach out to take my bag. He did not kneel to hug his grandson. He looked at my faded winter coat. Then he looked out at my ancient sedan idling in his driveway, leaking exhaust into the pristine mountain air. "You cannot stay in the main house," Thomas said. His voice was as flat and unyielding as the frozen ground beneath my feet. "Brenda is hosting the Commerce Board this weekend. It does not look good." I tightened my grip on Leo's hand. The cold was already seeping through the soles of my shoes, but the chill radiating from the doorway was worse. "Dad, I just need a few weeks," I said, "just until I find a job. Leo is freezing." Thomas let out a slow breath. He stepped out onto the porch and pointed toward the tree line at the edge of the property. "The old hunting cabin is empty," he said. "You can use that. But we run a tight ship here, Anaya. No free rides." The hunting cabin was 400 square feet of uninsulated wood. It had a rusted sink, a hot plate, and a draft that rattled the window panes. It smelled of damp earth and neglect. But it had a roof. I nodded. I thanked him. I picked up my bag and trudged through the snow to the back of the property. I spent the first night wrapped in my coat, holding Leo against my chest to share body heat. The wind howled through the gaps in the floorboards. The next morning, I walked back to the main house to ask to borrow a space heater. My father was sitting in his leather chair in his study. The room smelled of expensive coffee and polished leather. He did not look up from his computer screen. He just slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. I picked it up. It was a formal lease agreement. The rent was $1,200 a month, due on the 1st. "Dad," I whispered. The paper shook in my hands. "I have $42 to my name. You know I have nothing." Thomas finally looked up. His eyes held no sympathy, only a cold, transactional calculation. "Then you better start scrubbing floors," he said, "because the oil for that cabin heater is expensive, and I control the valve from my phone. Rent is due in 2 weeks." I stared at the man who had raised me. He was weaponizing the Wyoming winter against his own daughter. He was daring me to fail. He wanted me to break. He wanted me to pack up my car and disappear so his perfect family image could remain untarnished. I folded the paper. I slid it into my pocket. I did not cry. I just turned around and walked back out into the snow. I had 2 weeks to find $1,200. I had 2 weeks to learn how to survive in a town built for the rich. I had no idea that scrubbing floors would be the very thing that handed me the keys to the kingdom. The cold inside the hunting cabin was different from the cold outside. Outside, the wind had a voice. It whipped through the pine branches and rattled the gutters. Inside, the cold was silent. It sat heavy in the air, settling into the corners of the single room and creeping up through the bare wooden floorboards. I stood in the center of the 400-square-foot space. I still wore my winter coat. Leo was wrapped in a woolen blanket on the sagging mattress in the corner. He was already asleep, exhausted from the 8-hour drive. I pulled the lease agreement from my pocket and smoothed the wrinkled paper against the rusted edge of the kitchen sink. $1,200 a month. The heavy thud of boots on the porch snapped my attention away from the paper. The door opened without a knock. My father stepped inside. He did not take off his leather gloves. He did not stamp the snow from his boots. He held his smartphone in his right hand, the screen illuminating his face in the dim cabin light. He walked past me and stopped in front of the small digital thermostat mounted on the wall near the bathroom door. "You need to understand how this works," Thomas said. His tone was brisk. It was the exact voice he used to negotiate lumber shipments at his hardware stores. He held up his phone. The screen displayed a proprietary home management app. He tapped a gear icon. A schematic of the property appeared, showing the main lodge and the small square representing my cabin. "The heating oil tank is buried behind the main garage," he explained. It feeds both houses. But the valve for this cabin is electronic. It connects to the main network. He tapped the screen again. A green circle glowed next to the word cabin. Green means the valve is open, Thomas said. Oil is flowing. Heat costs money, Anaya. It cost me $4 a gallon to fill that tank. If you are late on the first of the month, I tap this button. He pressed his thumb against the screen. The green circle turned red. Instantly, the low hum of the baseboard heater sputtered and died. The silence in the room deepened. The temperature seemed to drop a degree in that single second. It is a smart system, he continued. He pressed the button again. The icon turned green. The heater groaned back to life. Very efficient. You pay your way, and the heat stays on. You skip a payment, and the valve closes. I do not chase tenants for rent. He slipped the phone back into his coat pocket. He did not look at Leo sleeping under the blanket. He just turned and walked out, closing the door firmly behind him. I stood staring at the digital thermostat. My father was not just charging me rent. He was holding a digital gun to my son. He controlled the exact temperature of our survival from the warmth of his leather armchair. The next morning I drove into town. Jackson Hole is a place of stark contrasts. Billionaires fly in on private jets to ski for 2 weeks a year, leaving their sprawling timber and glass estates empty for the other 50. I walked into the office of a local property staffing agency. I walked out with a schedule, a uniform polo shirt, and a starting wage of $18 an hour. The labor was brutal. I scrubbed imported Italian tile. I polished copper soaking tubs. I vacuumed hand-woven rugs in living rooms that featured floor-to-ceiling views of the Tetons. The irony tasted like ash in my mouth. I spent 10 hours a day making sure empty mansions stayed a perfect 72 degrees, while I worried about the oil valve clicking shut on my shivering child. My hands cracked from the cheap industrial bleach the agency provided. My back ached from leaning over porcelain sinks. $18 an hour, multiplied by 40 hours, was barely enough to cover the lease my father forced on me. It left nothing for groceries, nothing for gas, and nothing for emergencies. The pressure of the town was heavy, but the pressure on the Phillips family compound was suffocating. Sunday dinners at the main lodge were mandatory. Brenda framed them as family bonding, but they were truly weekly inspections. On my second Sunday back, I was standing at the kitchen sink of the main house washing preparation dishes. The roar of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet afternoon. I looked out the window. A silver Porsche Panamera carved its way up the circular driveway. The tires crunched arrogant and loud over the fresh snow. Derek stepped out of the driver's side door. He wore a tailored camel hair coat and aviator sunglasses despite the fading light. He was a wealth manager who spoke in stock tickers and golf handicaps. He walked around to the passenger side to open the door for my sister. Harper stepped out. She wore a pristine cashmere sweater. Her hair was perfectly styled, but her shoulders carried a rigid tension. She did not look at her husband. She walked straight toward the front door. Brenda rushed past me in the kitchen, wiping her hands on a fresh towel. "Anaya," my mother snapped. She pointed a manicured finger toward the driveway. "Your car is parked right in the front circle. Move it, quickly." I looked at my 2008 Honda Civic. It sat quietly near the stone steps. The paint was chipping on the hood. "Derek needs the prime spot," Brenda continued, pushing her way into the foyer. "And frankly, the neighbors can see your bumper from the road. The HOA is very strict about eyesores. Park it behind the pines, behind the garage, out of sight." I dried my cracked hands on a paper towel. I walked out the side door into the biting wind. Derek was standing on the porch holding a bottle of scotch. He watched me trudge through the snow toward my frozen car. "Make sure you do not leak oil on the cobblestones, Anaya," Derek called out. He swirled the amber liquid in the glass my father had just handed him. "That stone is imported. Costs a fortune to power wash." I did not reply. I slid into the driver's seat. The vinyl was freezing. I turned the key. The engine turned over with a painful mechanical whine. I reversed the car, driving it past the gleaming Porsche, steering it behind the tall pine trees, where no one from the road or the lodge could see it. I killed the engine. I sat in the dark, hidden behind the branches, holding the steering wheel until my fingers went numb. When I returned to the house, dinner was already served. I was not offered a seat. Brenda asked me to clear the salad plates. I walked around the table gathering the fine china. Derek was holding court. He leaned back in his chair, boasting about a recent tech IPO he had leveraged for a client. My father nodded along, hanging on every word, treating his son-in-law like royalty. I reached for Harper's plate. She had barely touched her food. She stared blankly at the centerpiece. Her jaw was tight. She gripped her wine glass so hard I thought the crystal might shatter in her hand. She was the golden child, the board-certified pediatrician with the wealthy husband, but her eyes looked hollow. When she noticed me looking, she quickly plastered on a bright fake smile and took a sip of her wine. The illusion of perfection in that room was suffocating. They were all playing a part, but I was the only one paying the admission fee in physical labor. November bled into December. The Wyoming winter arrived with brutal force. The snow piled high against the thin walls of my cabin. I sat on the sagging mattress one evening, counting crumpled bills I had earned from picking up an extra weekend cleaning shift. The math did not work. Rent was due in 4 days. I had exactly $42 left after paying for groceries and a tank of gas. Leo sat on the floor playing with a wooden block. I watched him stand up to walk toward the small bathroom. His toes curled inward against the freezing floorboards. His winter boots sitting by the door were splitting at the seams. He had outgrown them a month ago. I looked at the digital thermostat on the wall. The green icon glowed in the dim light, a constant, silent threat. If I bought Leo a new pair of boots, I would be short on the $1,200. If I was short on the money, my father would open his smartphone. He would press his thumb against the screen. The green light would turn red. The wind howled outside, rattling the glass in the single window. The temperature was set to drop below zero by midnight. I pulled my phone from my pocket and stared at my bank balance. $42. I needed a miracle. Or I needed to stop playing by their rules. The truth about extreme wealth is that it breeds extreme carelessness. When you have $50 million sitting in an investment account, a $5,000 repair bill is rounding error. I learned this reality on my knees, scrubbing grout in a 6-bedroom chalet perched on the edge of the Snake River. The staffing agency sent me there to deep clean after the owners, a tech executive and his wife, flew back to Silicon Valley. I was emptying the kitchen trash when I noticed a perfectly good Dyson vacuum cleaner shoved next to the recycling bin. A sticky note on the handle read, "Broken, toss it." I plugged it in out of curiosity. It hummed perfectly. The filter just needed to be washed. Later that same day, I was wiping down the custom mahogany cabinets in the master bathroom. I noticed a steady drip leaking from the luxury rain shower head. The water was pooling on the marble floor, seeping toward the baseboards. I followed the agency protocol and called the property management hotline. I sat on hold for 45 minutes listening to terrible elevator music while the water continued to spread. When a dispatcher finally answered, he sounded bored. He told me to throw down a towel and said they might get a plumber out by next Tuesday. I hung up the phone. I stared at the spreading puddle. A warped hardwood floor in a house this size would cost $30,000 to replace. The billionaire owner sitting in California had no idea his investment was rotting because the management company he hired did not care. Billionaires do not need maids. They need fortresses. They need discreet, ruthless efficiency. They need someone who treats their properties like gold vaults. That night, I sat in the freezing front seat of my hidden Honda Civic. The cabin was too small and the walls were too thin. If my father walked past and heard me talking, he would ask questions. The car was my only sanctuary. I turned the key halfway just to run the battery so I could plug in my dying laptop. My breath plumed in the cold air, illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screen. I navigated to the Wyoming Secretary of State website. My fingers were stiff and numb as I typed on the keyboard. I paid the $100 filing fee using a high-interest credit card I had hidden for emergencies. The name on the digital certificate was Apex Alpine Management, LLC. I did not quit the staffing agency immediately. I used their schedule as a reconnaissance map. Every time they sent me to clean a neglected estate, I left behind a heavy, stock slate gray business card on the kitchen island. The card had no title, just a phone number and a promise. Elite Asset Protection, 24-hour discreet response. The first call came 3 days later. It was a hedge fund manager from New York. His smart home system had alerted him to a freezing temperature in his Jackson property. His current management company told him it was a glitch. I drove there at midnight. I found a shattered window in the guest wing and the pipes mere hours from bursting. I boarded the window, called an emergency plumber, and had the mess sanitized before sunrise. The hedge fund manager fired his old company that morning. He signed a retainer with Apex Alpine for $10,000 a month. I sat in my car outside the bank, staring at the deposit slip. $10,000. My hands shook. I had made more in a single night than I had in the last 6 months combined. I drove straight to a boutique children's store in town. I bought Leo a heavy down insulated winter coat. It was pristine white. It cost $300. I watched him put it on. He looked like a small, invincible astronaut. He smiled and twirled in the snow. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of pure, unadulterated power. But power in the shadows is fragile. You have to carry two faces. On Saturday, my mother hosted a dinner party for Harper. The guest list included local hospital administrators and a few wealthy clients from Derek's firm. Brenda demanded I handle the cleanup. She did not ask. She left a printed checklist taped to the cabin door. I waited in the kitchen until the guests departed. The dining room looked like a battlefield of half-eaten filet mignon and spilled Cabernet. I tied my black catering apron over my jeans. I filled a plastic bucket with hot, soapy water. Brenda walked into the dining room holding an empty wine glass. She stepped carefully over a stain on the rug. "Make sure you use the enzymatic cleaner on the hardwood, Anaya," she instructed. She leaned against the doorframe, watching me kneel to scrub the floor. Derek spilled his drink earlier. He was telling a very animated story about a new acquisition. Such a brilliant mind. I kept my head down. My sponge moved in rhythmic circles. I told Harper she needs to be careful with the catering staff she hires for her next gala. Brenda continued. She took a sip from her empty glass, seemingly unaware there was no wine left. Good help is so hard to find. Not everyone is suited for complex tasks. It is good you have this little mop gig. It keeps you busy. I scrubbed harder. The soap foamed white against the dark wood. In the pocket of my jeans, beneath the cheap black apron, sat a leather wallet. Inside that wallet was a titanium business credit card, linking to an account holding $42,000 in cleared funds. My mother looked down at me. She saw a failure, a cautionary tale. She saw a woman begging for scraps. I looked at the floor and smiled a cold, tight smile. The dramatic irony was a drug. They thought they were stepping on a peasant. They had no idea they were wiping their feet on a CEO who earned more in a week than Derek managed to scrape together in a fiscal quarter. I finished the floor, wiped down the counters, and walked back out into the snow. The white winter coat was hanging safely in my small closet. My secret was secure. Or so I thought. The growth of Apex Alpine was explosive. Word of mouth in the billionaire class travels faster than private jets. By late January, I had 6 estates under full management. I could no longer handle the workload alone. I hired 3 local contractors, a dedicated plumber, an electrician, and a landscaping crew. I leased 2 unmarked black Mercedes Sprinter vans to move my teams around the valley silently. I registered the vehicles under the LLC using a P.O. box in a neighboring county. I thought I had covered every track. But Jackson Hole is a small town, wrapped in a big facade. It was a Sunday evening, the mandatory family dinner at the main lodge. I sat at the far end of the table, cutting Leo's chicken into tiny pieces. Thomas sat at the head, swirling his scotch. Derek sat to his right, checking his phone under the table. "The market dynamics are shifting in the valley," Thomas announced. He cut into his steak with precise, aggressive motions. "The old management guard is getting pushed out." I froze. My knife halted halfway through a piece of chicken. "What do you mean?" Derek asked. He did not look up from his screen. "There is a new player in town," Thomas said. He chewed his food thoughtfully. "I had drinks with the zoning commissioner on Friday. He said half the estates on the North Ridge have switched to a shadow company. Nobody knows who runs it. They do not advertise. But they are ruthless. The commissioner said they run a fleet of unmarked black vans, completely invisible operations." A drop of sweat rolled down the center of my spine. The black vans. I had specifically chosen them to avoid attention, but in a valley of flashy logos, silence itself had become a beacon. Probably some corporate conglomerate out of Denver trying to monopolize the luxury service sector. Derek scoffed. He pocketed his phone and reached for his wine. They always swoop in and undercut the local guys. They have massive capital backing. You cannot fight that kind of money. Maybe, Thomas mused. But the commissioner said they are buying up local supply contracts. I need to figure out who the principal is. If they are expanding that fast, they are going to need hardware and materials. I want the supply contract for my stores. I stared at my plate. My father was actively hunting the principal of the shadow company. He wanted a piece of the pie. He wanted to shake the hand of the CEO who was taking over the North Ridge. He was hunting me. If Thomas discovered the truth, he would not congratulate me. He would demand a cut. He would use the lease agreement on the cabin to extort equity. He would claim the business was built on his land, making it his asset. He would tear Apex Alpine from my hands and hand the reins to Derek. I needed to move my operations completely out of his reach. I needed capital to secure a commercial office space in Victor, Idaho, across the state line. I needed a war chest to build a fortress around my company before my father stumbled onto the truth. I could not go to a traditional bank. Thomas played golf with every loan officer in the county. A credit check under my name would trigger an alert straight to his phone. I needed a ghost investor, someone with deep pockets and a deep-seated hatred for the Phillips family rules. I knew exactly who to call. But dialing that number meant waking a dragon my mother had spent 2 decades trying to bury. The wind off the Teton Range was relentless. It stripped the heat from the engine block of my Honda before the heater could even push air into the cabin. I sat in the parking lot of a diner 30 miles outside of Jackson, tapping my frozen fingers against the steering wheel. I was waiting for a ghost. Aunt Sylvia was a banned word in the Phillips household. She was my mother Brenda's older sister. 20 years ago, Sylvia had been groomed for the same social climbing trajectory. She was expected to marry a local oil baron. Instead, Sylvia walked away from the altar on the day of the rehearsal dinner. She bought a plot of land in Idaho, opened an independent landscaping nursery, and never looked back. Brenda called her a failure, a disgrace. The family cut her off entirely. I watched a mud-splattered Ford F250 pull into the spot next to me. The driver's side door creaked open. Sylvia stepped out. She wore worn denim work boots and a heavy Carhartt jacket. Her silver hair was pulled back in a messy braid. She did not look like a failure. She looked like a woman who owned her own gravity. We walked into the diner. It smelled of stale coffee and fried potatoes. We sat in a corner booth far from the windows. Sylvia ordered black coffee. She did not ask about my mother. She did not ask about the weather. She just pointed a calloused finger at the manila folder I had placed on the Formica table. "Let us see the numbers, Anaya," she said. Her voice was raspy, grounded. I opened the folder. I spread out the profit and loss statements, the client retention graphs, and the projected operating costs for the next 6 months. "I need $25,000, I said. My voice was steady, but my heart hammered against my ribs. I needed to lease commercial space across the state line, to purchase equipment outright, and to establish a legal firewall. My father is looking for the owner of the shadow company operating on the North Ridge. If he finds out it is me, he will use the cabin lease to claim my assets." Sylvia pulled a pair of reading glasses from her pocket. She scanned the spreadsheets. Her eyes tracked the columns of numbers. The silence stretched. A waitress dropped off 2 mugs of coffee and walked away without a word. Sylvia closed the folder. She took a slow sip of her coffee. "These margins are lean," she stated. You are undercharging for the level of discretion you are providing. I'm undercutting the established firms to gain market share, I countered. Once they are locked into my ecosystem, I adjust the rates. The service is flawless. They will pay it. Sylvia leaned back against the vinyl booth. She studied my face. She looked past the tired eyes and the cheap clothing. She looked for the iron underneath. Your mother always said you were too soft, Sylvia noted. She said you lacked the killer instinct Harper had. Harper has a killer instinct for performing, I replied. I have a killer instinct for survival. There is a difference. A slow, genuine smile cracked across Sylvia's weathered face. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a worn leather checkbook. She clicked a pen and wrote the figures with swift, decisive strokes. She tore the check from the binding and slid it across the table. $25,000. I stared at the slip of paper. It was a lifeline. It was a weapon. Sylvia reached out and tapped the table, drawing my eyes up to meet hers. Take the money, Anaya, she said. Her tone shifted from business to something profoundly protective. But understand this. A legal firewall will not save you if you stay in their orbit. You cannot heal in the cage that broke you. You have to buy your freedom, and then you have to lock the door behind you. I folded the check. I placed it in my pocket, right next to the titanium corporate credit card. I'm not just locking the door, Aunt Sylvia, I whispered. I am buying the building. The capital injection acted like rocket fuel. Within 72 hours, I leased a small, unmarked warehouse in Victor, Idaho. I moved the operations base entirely off the grid. The black Sprinter vans were parked behind tall security fences. The invoicing was routed through an Idaho address. Apex Alpine was now a fortress. I scaled the team. I brought on a dedicated dispatcher. I expanded the client list from 6 estates to 14. The revenue stream transformed from a steady river into a rushing current. I was untouchable in the shadows. But the physical reality of my living situation remained tethered to the whims of a man who thrived on control. 2 weeks after the diner meeting, Thomas summoned me to his study. The heavy mahogany doors were shut tight. Inside, the air was stifling. Thomas sat behind his massive desk. He was not alone. 2 men in sharp suits sat in the leather guest chairs holding briefcases. They looked like predators resting after a hunt. Sit down, Anaya, Thomas ordered. He gestured to a small wooden chair in the corner of the room, far from the center of power. I sat. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I wore my faded winter coat to maintain the illusion of the struggling daughter. We are making some strategic moves, Thomas announced. He steepled his fingers, resting his elbows on the polished desk. The property values in Jackson are skyrocketing. The acreage we are sitting on right now is prime real estate. I have spent the last month organizing the neighbors. We have formed a coalition. We are selling the entire Ridge block as a single commercial parcel to a mega developer. The words hit me like a physical blow. Selling the Ridge. That meant selling the land under the main lodge. That meant selling the dirt under my cabin. The buyer is highly motivated, Thomas continued, his chest puffing out with self-importance. He wants to build an eco-resort. He is willing to pay an astronomical premium for a clean sweep of the land. No encumbrances, no tenants. He reached into his top drawer. He pulled out a thick document printed on heavy legal paper. He slid it across the desk toward the edge, forcing me to stand up and walk over to retrieve it. I picked up the document. The bold black letters at the top screamed the reality. Formal notice to vacate. You have 90 days, Anaya Thomas stated. He leaned back in his chair, the picture of corporate efficiency. The developer requires empty possession before closing. You need to pack your things and find a new place. The lease on the hunting cabin is terminated effective immediately upon the end of the 90-day period. I looked at the men in the suits. They avoided my gaze, staring politely at the wall art. I looked back at my father. Dad, I said, keeping my voice low, keeping the panic simulated. 90 days puts us right in the middle of winter. The rental market is dead right now. Leo and I will have nowhere to go. "You have had 4 years to figure out a plan," Thomas replied coldly. "You have been cleaning houses, making pocket change. It is time to grow up. The coalition is not going to lose a $50 million payday because you cannot manage your finances. You have 90 days. Do not ask for an extension." He dismissed me with a wave of his hand, turning his attention back to the lawyers. I walked out of the study, closing the heavy mahogany door behind me. My boots echoed loudly on the hardwood floor of the hallway. 90 days, a ticking clock. I had capital in the bank, but securing a luxury lease in Jackson Hole required extensive background checks and financial disclosures. If I signed a lease under my own name, Thomas would eventually hear about it through his real estate connections. He would know I had money. He would dig into the source. He would find Apex Alpine and use the remaining time on the cabin lease to drag me into a brutal legal battle, claiming I operated a hidden commercial business on his residential-zoned land. I needed to secure my escape without leaving a paper trail. I needed a move so audacious it defied scrutiny. I needed to land a client so massive, so undeniably powerful, that their protection shielded me from my father's reach entirely. I needed a whale. I just did not expect the whale to dial my number directly. Nor did I expect him to be the very man holding the executioner's axe over my father's head. The dispatcher's voice on the encrypted phone line was tight with urgency. It was 3 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. The sky over the Tetons was an angry, bruised purple, promising heavy snowfall. "Anaya," the dispatcher said, "we have a code red on the Sterling compound." The name sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system. The Sterling compound was a myth, wrapped in glass and steel. It was a $40 million fortress built into the side of a cliff face overlooking the valley. The owner, Julian Sterling, was a phantom in the tech world. He bought companies, dismantled them, and sold the parts for astronomical profits. He was reputed to be brilliant, demanding, and completely devoid of patience. "What is the situation?" I asked. I slammed my laptop shut and grabbed my heavy coat from the back of the chair in my Idaho warehouse office. "Main waterline failure in the east wing," the dispatcher rattled off the details. "The radiant heating system shorted and froze the pipes. They burst 10 minutes ago. Water is flooding the Grand Hall. Here is the kicker. Sterling is hosting a private fundraising gala tonight. Caterers are arriving in 2 hours. Guests arrive in 5. His current management company told him it was impossible to fix today. They told Julian Sterling, impossible. I practically sprinted toward my unmarked Sprinter van. Yes, he fired them over the phone. He demanded the best shadow operator in the valley. One of our hedge fund clients gave him your direct emergency line. Deploy the strike team. I commanded, throwing the van into gear. I want 2 commercial extractors on site in 20 minutes. Call Martinez for plumbing bypass and get the restoration crew moving. I am heading there now. I drove the mountain roads with reckless precision. When I arrived at the compound, the scene was chaotic. Water cascaded down the custom floating staircase, pooling on the imported Brazilian hardwood floors of the Grand Hall. Panicked catering staff huddled in the dry kitchen, terrified to move. Standing in the center of the flooding hall, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and calfskin boots, was Julian Sterling. He held an iPad. He was typing furiously, seemingly unbothered by the destruction happening inches from his footwear. He looked up as I walked through the double doors. I did not wear a uniform. I wore dark, functional clothing and carried a digital clipboard. I moved past him without offering a pleasantry. "Martinez!" I shouted over the sound of rushing water to my lead plumber who had just arrived. "Kill the main, isolate the east wing manifold, and cap the ruptured line. You have 8 minutes." I turned to the restoration crew, dragging heavy hoses into the room. "Set the extractors on maximum suction. Start at the edges and work toward the center. Do not let the water sit on the seams." I pivoted toward the terrified catering manager. "Move your prep stations to the West Terrace kitchen. It is offline, but the power grid is stable. I will have temporary heating units set up out there in 15 minutes. Go." I directed the chaos like a symphony conductor. I did not raise my voice again. I pointed. I instructed. I demanded swift, brutal efficiency. The water stopped flowing in 7 minutes. The extraction machines roared, drowning out all other noise. Within an hour, the floor was dry. Within 2 hours, the restoration crew had deployed high-speed dehumidifiers disguised behind decorative screens. The room smelled of pine and expensive floor wax, not stagnant water. The caterers began plating hors d'oeuvres in the main hall, right on schedule. I stood near the coat check, reviewing the final moisture readings on my tablet. The crisis was averted. The gala would proceed flawlessly. The previous company told me it would take a week to mitigate that damage. I looked up. Julian Sterling stood beside me. Up close, his features were sharp, unyielding. His eyes were the color of polished flint. He did not offer his hand. He did not smile. "They lacked imagination, Mr. Sterling," I replied, keeping my tone neutral, professional. "And they lacked the proper equipment. They lacked competence," Julian corrected. He slipped his hands into his suit pockets. "I despise incompetence. It is a theft of my time." "Who are you?" "I am the solution to your estate management problems," I said. "My name is Anaya. I run Apex Alpine." Julian studied me. He assessed the lack of a branded uniform, the quiet authority I commanded, and the sheer speed of the recovery operation. He recognized a fellow predator. "I need a fortress, Anaya," he stated simply. "I am not here often, but when I am, I require perfection. Security, logistics, maintenance. I want a ghost operation. I want problems solved before I even know they exist." "That is exactly what Apex Alpine provides," I assured him. "Send me a proposal," Julianne demanded, turning to walk back toward the grand hall to greet his early arrivals. "Make it hurt. If it is cheap, I will assume you are cutting corners." I went back to my hidden office that night and drafted the contract. I did not hesitate. I priced the annual retainer at $450,000. It was an astronomical figure. It was a declaration of absolute superiority. I emailed the document at midnight. The signed contract was returned to my inbox at 6 in the morning, along with a wire transfer confirmation for the first quarterly payment. $112,000. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. The money was real. The power was real. I was no longer fighting for scraps. I had secured the whale. Later that afternoon, I drove to the boutique children's store in town. I walked straight to the premium winter gear section. I found the heavy down insulated coat I had seen weeks ago, the pristine white one that cost $300. I bought it. I bought matching thermal boots and waterproof gloves. I brought the bags back to the freezing cabin. Leo was sitting on the sagging mattress playing with a broken toy car. I pulled the white coat from the bag and held it up. "Try this on, Leo," I said. My voice was thick with emotion I refused to shed. He slipped his arms into the sleeves. The coat fit perfectly. It was thick, warm, and brilliant against the dreary backdrop of the cabin walls. He looked like a prince. He zipped it up to his chin and smiled, a wide, gap-toothed grin. "It is so warm, Mommy," he whispered. I pulled him into a tight embrace. The fabric was resilient. It was armor. I had bought my son armor. The first massive retainer check had not just secured my business, it had secured my ability to protect my child. I kissed the top of his head and stood up. I needed to call Julian Sterling's executive assistant to finalize the security protocols for the compound. I dialed the number from my encrypted phone. The assistant connected me directly to Julian, who was currently en route to an airport. Anaya Julian's voice came through the speaker, crisp and authoritative. "The gala was a success. The floors look immaculate. Your team is efficient." "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," I replied. "We are implementing the new perimeter surveillance network tomorrow morning." "Excellent," Julian said. I could hear the roar of a jet engine spinning up in the background. "I will be back in Wyoming the week of Christmas. I have some local annoyances to eradicate." "Annoyances?" I asked, carefully, ensuring my tone remained strictly professional. "A stubborn local coalition," Julian scoffed. The disdain in his voice was palpable. "They own a large block of acreage on the North Ridge. I am trying to buy it for a new eco-resort development. The ringleader is a loudmouth hardware store owner. He thinks he is a master negotiator. He is holding up a $50 million deal, trying to squeeze a few extra points out of my holding company. The blood drained from my face. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 20 degrees. The North Ridge, a local hardware store owner, a $50 million eco-resort development. Julian Sterling was the mega developer. He was the man my father was trying to sell the Ridge to. Julian was the reason Thomas had handed me a 90-day eviction notice. I am flying back for Christmas to crush this coalition personally, Julian continued, oblivious to the silence on my end of the line. I am going to strip this local hardware peddler of his leverage and force the sale on my terms. I want the compound fully staffed and prepped for a war room setup when I arrive. It will be ready, Mr. Sterling, I managed to whisper. My throat felt like it was coated in sand. I ended the call. The phone slipped from my hand, landing softly on the worn blanket covering the mattress. The dramatic irony had twisted into a terrifying knot. I was managing the fortress of the very billionaire who was coming to destroy my father, and my father was actively trying to evict me to sell the land to my biggest client. If Thomas discovered the connection, he would ruin the deal. If Julian discovered my father was my landlord, he might view me as a compromised asset. The walls were closing in rapidly. I needed to accelerate my escape timeline. I needed to find a permanent home before Christmas. But a sudden, violent knock on the cabin door shattered my planning. The illusion of safety I had carefully constructed was about to be ripped apart by the most desperate member of the Phillips family. The knock on the cabin door was frantic. It was not the authoritative thud my father used. It was desperate, sharp, and rapid. I shoved my encrypted phone under a pillow and cracked the door open. My sister Harper stood on the small wooden porch. She was not wearing her pristine cashmere. She wore an oversized gray sweatshirt and yoga pants. Her hair was a tangled mess. Her makeup from the previous day was smeared in dark circles under her eyes. She was shaking, and it was not just from the biting Wyoming wind. "Harper?" I asked, pulling the door wider. "What is wrong?" She pushed past me, stepping into the dim, freezing cabin. She looked around the cramped space, taking in the sagging mattress, the rusted hot plate, and the single small window. A sob broke from her chest, loud and jagged. She sank onto the only wooden chair at the small kitchen table, burying her face in her hands. "I cannot do it anymore," Anaya Harper wept. Her voice was muffled, a raw sound of total defeat. "I just cannot keep pretending." I closed the door, quickly checking the driveway. Through the pine branches, I could see the silver Porsche parked near the edge of the property line. The engine was running, exhaust plumed into the cold air. Derek sat in the driver's seat, watching the cabin. Even from a distance, I could feel the nervous, twitchy energy radiating from his posture. I walked over to the table and knelt beside my sister. The golden child, the board-certified pediatrician, the pride of the Phillips family, was crumbling in my 400-square-foot shack. "Pretending what, Harper?" I asked gently, keeping my voice low. She lifted her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed and terrified. Everything she whispered. The dam broke, and the truth poured out in a torrential flood. Derek lost his job 6 months ago. His firm let him go after a disastrous series of trades. He has not told anyone. He leaves the house every morning in a suit and sits in a coffee shop pretending to work. I stared at her. The wealth manager with the leased Porsche was unemployed? "It gets worse," Harper continued, a hysterical edge creeping into her tone. "We are drowning, Anaya. My medical school loans, the mortgage, the car leases. We are $300,000 in the hole. The bank sent a notice of intent to foreclose last week. They are going to take the house." "Does Mom know?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. Brenda would have orchestrated a massive cover-up if she knew her perfect daughter was bankrupt. "No," Harper gasped, grabbing my arm. Her grip was painfully tight. "Mom thinks I am running for the regional medical board next month. She is planning a massive campaign launch party at the country club. If she finds out Derek is unemployed and we are broke, she will lose her mind. She will disown me." The irony was suffocating. My parents had spent 4 years mocking my poverty while financing an elaborate illusion of wealth for my sister. They built a shrine to a life that did not exist. Harper looked around the dismal cabin again. She looked at me, wearing a faded sweater. She assumed I was exactly what my mother said I was, a struggling maid scraping by on minimum wage. Anaya Harper said, her voice dropping to a shameful whisper, "The power company sent a shut-off notice. They are cutting the electricity to our house tomorrow morning if we do not pay the past due balance." Derek maxed out his last credit card trying to keep up appearances at the club. She swallowed hard, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I need $500, Harper begged. The words tasted like poison in her mouth. The golden child asking the maid for a handout. "Just until I get my paycheck on Friday, please. I know you do not have much. I know you save your tip money, but I am desperate. I will pay you back, I swear." I looked at my sister. Stripped of the designer clothes and the parental expectations, she was just a terrified woman trapped in a nightmare created by a fraudulent husband and demanding parents. She was collateral damage in the Phillips family war for status. I did not feel vindicated. I felt a profound, cold pity. I stood up. I walked over to my duffel bag hidden under the bed. I unzipped a side pocket and pulled out a leather checkbook. It was not my personal account. It was the corporate operating account for Apex Alpine Management. I had hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in cleared funds. $500 was less than what I charged a client for an emergency plumbing call-out. I clicked a pen and wrote the check quickly. I filled out Harper's name and signed the bottom. I did not hesitate. I walked back to the table and handed the slip of paper to my sister. Harper stared at the check. Her eyes widened. The tears stopped momentarily, replaced by shock. She looked at the amount. She looked at my signature. Then her eyes drifted up to the top left corner of the check where the account holder name was printed in bold black ink. Apex Alpine, LLC. Anaya Harper asked, her voice wavering with confusion. "What is this? What is Apex Alpine?" I maintained a mask of total calm. My pulse raced, but my expression remained flat. "It is a payroll company," I lied smoothly. "The staffing agency uses them to process contractor payments. They issue us draw checks for emergencies against our future hours. Do not worry about it. Just deposit it before the power company cuts your lights." Harper was too exhausted and too desperate to question the logic. She folded the check carefully and slipped it into the pocket of her sweatshirt. "Thank you," she whispered, standing up. She looked at me with a new tentative respect. "You saved me, Anaya. I will not forget this." "Go home, Harper," I said, opening the cabin door. "Pay the bill, and tell your husband to stop pretending." Harper walked out into the freezing wind. I watched her trudge across the snow-covered grass toward the waiting Porsche. I stayed in the doorway, hidden in the shadows, monitoring the interaction. Harper opened the passenger door and slid into the leather seat. Derek immediately turned toward her. Even through the windshield, I could see the aggressive, demanding set of his jaw. He was interrogating her, asking if she got the cash. Harper reached into her pocket. She pulled out the folded check and handed it to her husband. Derek snatched the paper from her hand. He unfolded it, holding it up to the dashboard light. I watched his posture shift. The aggressive demand morphed into sharp, calculated confusion. He stared at the check for a long time. He did not look at the amount. He was staring at the top left corner. Derek was a former wealth manager. He spent his career analyzing corporate structures, shell companies, and banking details. He knew what a payroll draw check looked like. And he knew that an LLC operating account check drawn on a premium-tier business banking institution was not issued to a maid cleaning vacation rentals. He lowered the check. He turned his head slowly, staring through the pine branches directly at my cabin. His eyes were not grateful. They were predatory. He looked at my dilapidated Honda Civic hidden behind the trees. He looked at the uninsulated wooden walls of the shack. Then he looked back at the premium corporate check in his hand. The math in his head was suddenly adding up to a terrifying sum. Derek pulled a smartphone from his coat pocket. He He kept his eyes locked on my cabin as his thumbs flew across the screen. He was not texting. He was opening a web browser. He was accessing the Wyoming Secretary of State Corporate Registry database. A cold sweat broke across my collarbone. If Derek searched the LLC name, he would find the registration details. He would find my name listed as the sole managing member. He would realize that the struggling maid living in his father-in-law's backyard was the principal owner of a corporate entity. More dangerously, he would realize I had money. Real, hidden, untouchable money. A desperate, bankrupt man with a leased Porsche and a fragile ego had just discovered a vault of cash sitting a few hundred yards away from his own financial ruin. Derek lowered his phone. He looked at the cabin one last time, a slow, malicious smile spreading across his face. He put the car in gear and sped out of the driveway, leaving a cloud of exhaust in the frozen air. He did not just have a secret now. He had leverage, and I knew with terrifying certainty that he was coming back to collect. The morning after Harper visited, my chest felt tight with an unspoken warning. I dropped Leo off at his elementary school, watching his small frame disappear through the double glass doors in his new white winter coat. I drove toward the North Ridge to inspect a property, but my mind remained tethered to the image of Derek staring at my cabin the previous night. I had taken precautions. My corporate laptop, the ledger containing my client list, and the manila envelope holding my tax returns were never left in plain sight. I had pried a section of the wooden baseboard away from the wall behind my sagging mattress. I hollowed out the insulation behind it, creating a narrow, hidden compartment. It was invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. I spent the daylight hours coordinating a landscaping crew for a client who demanded mature pine trees planted before the ground froze solid. The work was demanding, requiring constant supervision, but I could not shake the cold prickle of dread crawling up my spine. My phone stayed silent. No calls from Harper, no calls from my father. The silence felt like a drawn breath before a scream. I returned to the Phillips property just as the sun dipped behind the Tetons, casting long, jagged shadows across the snow. I parked my Honda Civic behind the trees. The wind had died down, leaving the air brittle and still. As I walked toward the cabin, my boots halted mid-step. Fresh footprints marred the snow leading directly up to my small wooden porch. They were not the small treads of my boots, or the wide, flat prints of my father. They were narrow, elongated impressions left by expensive leather dress shoes. My stomach dropped into a bottomless void. My fingertips went numb inside my gloves. I rushed up the steps. The cheap brass deadbolt on the cabin door was scratched. The metal casing was dented, indicating someone had forced a flathead screwdriver or a pry bar into the mechanism. The door hung open just a fraction of an inch. I pushed it wide. The interior of the cabin was in disarray. My few items of clothing were pulled from the plastic dresser drawers and tossed onto the floor. Leo's wooden blocks were kicked across the linoleum. But my eyes bypassed the petty vandalism and darted straight to the corner behind the mattress. The bed was dragged sideways. The wooden baseboard was ripped from the wall. The nails were bent, jutting out like crooked teeth. I dropped to my knees on the freezing floorboards. I reached into the dark, hollow space. My fingers brushed against empty air. The corporate laptop was gone. The manila envelope holding my federal tax returns and the Apex Alpine LLC registration documents was gone. A sharp metallic click sounded from the porch behind me. I spun around. The silhouette of a man blocked the doorway, blocking my only exit. Derek stepped into the cabin. He wore his tailored camel hair coat and a smug, triumphant smile. He held my silver laptop in his left hand. In his right hand, he tapped my thick manila envelope against his thigh. He looked like a hunter who had just trapped a very profitable prize. "You have been a very busy girl, Anaya," Derek said. His tone was casual, dripping with arrogant satisfaction. I stood up slowly. I kept my breathing even, refusing to give him the panic he was so desperate to consume. "Put those down, Derek," I said. My voice was low, resonant, with a quiet danger I did not know I possessed. "That is corporate property. Breaking and entering is a felony." Derek laughed. It was a harsh, grating sound that lacked any real humor. Breaking and entering. He raised an eyebrow, stepping further into the cramped room. This is my father-in-law's property. I am a guest of the family. I just came out here to check on a drafty window and stumbled upon a gold mine. He tossed the manila envelope onto the small kitchen table. The flap opened, spilling the documents across the scratched Formica surface. The top page was my quarterly profit and loss statement. The numbers were printed in stark, undeniable black ink. $3.2 million in gross revenue projected for this fiscal year, Derek read aloud, tracing the air with his finger. He shook his head, feigning disbelief. I have to hand it to you, Anaya. I thought you were just scrubbing toilets. I had no idea you were running a shadow monopoly right under Thomas Phillips' nose. What do you want? I demanded, cutting through the theatrical performance. Derek dropped the casual facade. The desperate, bankrupt man underneath clawed his way to the surface. His eyes narrowed, glittering with hostile intent. I want $50,000, Derek stated. I want it transferred into my personal checking account by Friday morning. I stared at him. He was trying to extort me to cover the debts his own incompetence had generated? You are out of your mind, I said, crossing my arms over my chest. I am not paying for your failed trades and your leased sports car. Derek slammed his hand against the kitchen table. The loud crack made me flinch backward. You will pay it because you have no other choice, Derek snarled, leaning toward me. His breath smelled of stale coffee and expensive mints. Let us talk about the law, Anaya. You are running a multi-million-dollar commercial enterprise. Your registered LLC address on these tax forms points directly to this cabin. He pointed a finger at the floorboards beneath our feet. This land is zoned strictly residential, he continued, his voice rising with manic energy. More importantly, your lease agreement with Thomas expressly forbids commercial activity. If I walk up to the main lodge right now and show your father these documents, what do you think he will do? The blood drained from my face. I knew exactly what my father would do. Thomas is ruthless, Derek whispered, savoring the fear flashing in my eyes. He is trying to sell this ridge to a developer. If he finds out you are running a rogue corporate entity on his dirt, he will not just evict you. He will sue you for breach of contract. He will claim a percentage of every dollar you earned on his property. He will freeze your corporate accounts, tie you up in litigation for years, and destroy your contracts. Your clients will flee the moment the subpoenas drop. Derek was right. If Thomas found out, he would burn Apex Alpine to the ground, just to claim the ashes. I had moved my operations to Idaho, but the original registration paperwork still tied my legal foundation to the Wyoming cabin. I needed time to process the address change through the state registry. I needed a buffer. Derek stepped back, picking up my laptop and the envelope. He tucked them firmly under his arm. You have been living rent-free on the family reputation for years, Derek sneered, looking down at me with unmasked contempt. Consider this a collection. The maid needs to pay her taxes to the real family. He walked backward, out the door, onto the porch. The Wyoming wind whipped his camel hair coat around his knees. You have 48 hours, Anaya, Derek called out over the howling wind. $50,000. If the money is not in my account by 8 in the morning on Friday, these documents go straight to Thomas. Then you lose the company, you lose the money, and you and your kid are sleeping in a snowbank. He turned and walked away, his expensive leather shoes crunching loud against the frozen ground. I stood in the doorway of the violated cabin, staring out into the darkening woods. The cold rushed in, chilling my skin, but a different kind of ice formed in my veins. Derek thought he had cornered a frightened maid. He thought he could use my father as a weapon to bleed me dry. He gave me 48 hours to surrender my empire to a leech. I closed the broken cabin door. I looked at the Pride baseboard and the scattered toys on the floor. I did not have $50,000 to waste on a failed wealth manager. But I had 48 hours. 48 hours to sever the legal chain connecting me to this land. 48 hours to render his blackmail entirely useless. Derek wanted to play a high-stakes game of leverage. He just did not realize he had brought a stolen laptop to a war. I did not scream when Derek drove away. I did not throw objects across the cramped cabin. Panic is a luxury for people who have someone else to clean up their messes. I picked up my encrypted phone from beneath the pillow. I dialed Derek's number. The line rang twice before he answered. "Have you already checked your balance, Anaya?" Derek asked. His tone dripped with supreme arrogance. I forced my breathing to shallow, uneven gasps. I squeezed my eyes shut, letting the exhaustion of the past 4 years bleed into my vocal cords. "Please, Derek," I begged, letting my voice crack perfectly on his name. "I cannot pull $50,000 out of the operating account without triggering a massive tax audit. It will ruin the company. Thomas will find out anyway if the IRS audits me." "That sounds like a you problem," Derek sneered. "Figure it out, or I walk up to the main lodge right now." "Wait," I cried out, injecting a desperate sob into the microphone. "Okay, you win. I will get the money. But I have to do a structured wire transfer in person. Meet me at First National Bank in town, Friday morning, 8 o'clock sharp." Derek let out a low, satisfied chuckle. It was the sound of a parasite finding a fresh host. "Do not be late, Anaya," he said, "and dress nicely. The tellers might mistake you for the janitorial staff." The call disconnected. I lowered the phone. The simulated terror vanished from my face, replaced by a cold, mechanical focus. I had secured a 48-hour window. Derek thought he had trapped a frightened maid. He was about to learn how a shadow CEO operates under pressure. I packed Leo into the Honda Civic. We drove through the dark, winding mountain roads toward Idaho. The heater in my car barely worked. I wrapped my son in a heavy blanket, keeping my eyes locked on the icy asphalt. We reached Aunt Sylvia's property just after midnight. Her independent landscaping nursery was a sprawling complex of commercial greenhouses and a sturdy timber frame house. Sylvia opened the door before I even reached the porch. She took one look at my face and ushered us inside out of the bitter wind. She poured a mug of black coffee and set it on her kitchen table. I opened my backup tablet. Derek broke into my cabin. I explained, my fingers flying across the digital keyboard. He stole my corporate tax returns and my laptop. He's trying to extort me for $50,000. He threatened to show Thomas the LLC registration, tying Apex Alpine to his residential property. Sylvia did not gasp. She sat across from me, her weathered face set in grim lines. "What do you need?" she asked. "I need your commercial address," I said. "I am filing an emergency amendment to my Articles of Organization with the Secretary of State. I am changing my registered agent and my principal operating address to this nursery, effective immediately." "Do it," Sylvia nodded. "Use the main office address." I logged into the state corporate registry portal. I uploaded the amendment forms. I paid the state-required expedited filing fees using my corporate card. Then the waiting game began. The state digital systems were notoriously slow. All day Thursday, I sat in Sylvia's kitchen refreshing the web browser. Every hour that passed felt like a tightening rope. If the state did not process the address change by Friday morning, Derek's stolen documents would still hold legal weight. My father could still claim I was operating a rogue commercial enterprise on his dirt. Thursday afternoon bled into Thursday evening. The sun sank behind the snow-capped peaks. I watched Leo play with a set of wooden trains on Sylvia's rug. I thought about the white winter coat. I thought about Julian Sterling expecting a flawless fortress. I could not lose my empire to a bankrupt coward. At 11 o'clock Thursday night, my tablet chimed. An automated email from the state registry illuminated the screen. The amendment was processed and approved. The digital seal was affixed. Apex Alpine Management LLC was officially and legally relocated to the commercial jurisdiction of Sylvia's nursery. The paper documents Derek held were now obsolete history. The legal chain connecting my wealth to my father's property was severed. Friday morning arrived crisp and blindingly bright. I parked my car in the lot of First National Bank in downtown Jackson. I did not wear my faded winter coat. I wore a sharp, tailored wool trench coat over a dark turtleneck. I looked like a woman who managed millions. A silver Porsche pulled into the spot next to me. The engine roared before dying out. Derek stepped out of the vehicle. He wore his camel hair coat and a silk scarf. He carried a sleek leather briefcase, expecting me to hand him a certified cashier check. He walked toward me with the swagger of a conqueror. "Good morning, Anaya," Derek greeted. He tapped the leather briefcase. "I brought the tax returns. We do the wire transfer inside, and I hand over the envelope. A clean transaction." I leaned against the door of my Honda. I did not move toward the bank entrance. I just looked at him. "We are not going inside, Derek," I said. My voice was calm, level, and devoid of any fear. Derek frowned. The arrogant smirk faltered just a fraction. "Do not play games with me," he warned, stepping closer. "If you do not have the funds, I will drive straight to the lodge. Thomas is having morning coffee in his study right now." I let out a soft, chilling laugh. The sound echoed in the cold morning air. It stopped Derek dead in his tracks. "Run to Thomas," I said. I crossed my arms over my tailored coat. "Show him the papers, Derek. Show him the old tax returns. Show him the voided address." Derek's eyes darted back and forth. His financial predator instincts finally caught up to the reality of the situation. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice losing its smooth veneer. "I spent the last 48 hours legally relocating my corporate entity to a commercial plot in Idaho," I explained. I enjoyed watching the color drain from his cheeks. "The state approved the amendment last night. Apex Alpine has zero legal or physical ties to Thomas Phillips or his land. You are holding a folder full of historical fiction." Derek opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "You have no leverage." I continued stepping toward him. I forced him to take a step back against his leased car. "You have no extortion material. You are just an unemployed, bankrupt man holding stolen property. If you show those papers to Thomas, he cannot sue me. He cannot evict me for commercial zoning violations because the business does not exist there anymore. But if you try it, I will press charges for felony burglary. I will have the police pull the security footage from the neighbors' cameras showing your car at my cabin." Derek stared at me. The realization of his total ruin crashed over him. He was out of options. The bank was right behind him, but he could not touch a single dollar of my wealth. "Tell Harper to check the mail," I added, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "The power company shutoff notice is real. You should probably head home and light some candles." I turned my back on him. I got into my car and drove away, leaving him standing frozen in the icy parking lot. Derek was humiliated and cornered. A cornered animal is dangerous, not because it is strong, but because it is unpredictable. He could not extort me for money, but his bruised ego demanded retaliation. He needed to punish me for outsmarting him. He drove his Porsche straight to the Phillips family lodge. He found Thomas sitting in his study reviewing the land survey maps for the Julian Sterling mega developer deal. Derek could not mention the millions of dollars, or the shadow company, without revealing his own failed blackmail attempt and his own breaking and entering. So he twisted the narrative. He used the only weapon he had left: paranoia. "Thomas," Derek said, pacing the floor of the study, feigning deep concern. "I was out by the cabin this morning. Anaya is acting incredibly erratic. She is bringing strange people around the property at all hours. Shady contractors, undesirables." Thomas looked up from his maps, his brow furrowed in irritation. "She is a liability," Thomas Derek whispered, leaning over the mahogany desk. He knew exactly which button to press. "You are weeks away from closing a $50 million deal with this developer. The buyer is coming for Christmas Eve. If he sees the state of that cabin, or sees the kind of element your daughter is attracting, he might pull out. Elite buyers want clean properties. You cannot risk this massive payday just to let her squat back there." Thomas stared at the map. His jaw tightened. The $50 million deal was his legacy. He would not let a failed, struggling daughter jeopardize his ultimate triumph. He had given her 90 days, but Derek's poison took root instantly. 90 days was too long. The risk was too high. She needed to leave before the developer arrived. She needed to be purged. Thomas did not say a word to Derek. He just reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out his smartphone. He bypassed his emails and his text messages. He opened the proprietary home management app. The schematic of the property loaded on the bright screen. He tapped the gear icon. He located the small square representing the hunting cabin. The green circle glowed steadily, indicating the oil valve was open. Thomas did not blink. He pressed his thumb against the screen. The change was not immediate. The baseboard heater in the cabin groaned, holding on to the residual warmth in the iron pipes for a few hours. I spent the afternoon at Aunt Sylvia's nursery, finalizing payroll for my landscaping crews and reviewing the security logs for the Julian Sterling compound. I felt a fleeting sense of victory. I had neutralized Derek. My corporate structure was secure. I picked Leo up from his after-school program. He was bubbling with excitement, wearing his pristine white winter coat, talking about a snow fort he built during recess. We drove back to the Phillips property just as the sky faded into a deep, bruised violet. I unlocked the cabin door. The air that greeted me was not just cold, it was dead. I flipped the light switch. The overhead bulb flickered, casting a dim yellow glow over the cramped space. I walked over to the digital thermostat on the wall. The screen was blank. The small icon that usually indicated oil flow was entirely dark. I knelt beside the baseboard heater. I pressed my bare hand against the metal fins. It was freezing to the touch. I pulled my phone from my pocket and checked the weather application. The temperature outside was dropping rapidly. It was currently 14 degrees and forecasted to hit -5 by midnight. My father had cut the oil. I did not owe rent for another 2 weeks. I had not violated any stated terms of the extortionate lease. Thomas had simply decided to freeze his own daughter and grandson out of his backyard. Derek's whispered poison had worked. Thomas prioritized the aesthetics of his real estate deal over the basic survival of his flesh and blood. "Mommy," Leo said. His small voice trembled slightly. "It is really cold in here. Can we turn on the heater?" I looked at my son. His breath formed small white clouds in the living room. Something deep inside my chest cracked. It was not a break of sorrow. It was the severing of the final invisible tether that bound me to the Phillips family. Any lingering hope that Thomas might harbor a shred of paternal decency evaporated in the sub-zero air. "The heater is broken tonight, baby," I said. I kept my voice perfectly level, masking the molten fury rising in my veins. But we are going to have a campout. In the car. I grabbed 3 heavy woolen blankets from the sagging mattress. I bundled Leo into the back seat of the Honda Civic. I started the engine. I turned the climate control dial to maximum heat. The car idled in the dark, hidden behind the pine trees, a tiny metal life raft in a sea of frozen betrayal. I sat in the driver's seat. The heater blasted dry, warm air against my face. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly the leather creaked. I was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar estate management firm. I commanded fleets of unmarked vans and crews of specialized contractors. I protected the fortresses of billionaires. And yet here I was, forced to sleep in a compact car to keep my child from freezing to death, because my father deemed my existence inconvenient. I pulled my encrypted tablet from my bag. I opened a secure browser. I navigated to a premium real estate listing portal for Jackson Hole. I bypassed the standard apartment rentals. I bypassed the modest single-family homes. I filtered the search results for luxury townhomes with immediate availability. I found it on the first page. A stunning 3-bedroom, modern timber and glass townhome located in the exclusive heart of the valley. It featured radiant floor heating, a gourmet chef kitchen, and a heated 2-car garage. The lease was $6,000 a month. I clicked the contact button. I filled out the digital application using the Apex Alpine LLC corporate credentials. I attached my flawless corporate banking statements, proving liquid assets well into the 7 figures. I paid the first, last, and security deposit electronically. The transaction was approved and processed in under 10 minutes. I had a new home, a fortress of my own. But I could not move my belongings yet. If Thomas saw me loading boxes into a moving truck, he would assume I was fleeing in defeat. He would reclaim the cabin, clean the slate, and present a pristine property to his developer buyer. He would win the narrative. I needed to maintain the illusion of the desperate, trapped Maid. I needed my father to believe his cruel tactic was working, right up until the moment the trap snapped shut on his own neck. I left the broken hot plate, the scattered toys, and the cheap clothing inside the freezing cabin. They were a decoy, a stage set for a play that was rapidly nearing its final act. The next morning, the sun rose blindingly bright, reflecting off the fresh snow. I woke up cramped in the driver's seat. Leo was asleep in the back, buried beneath the wool blankets. The car engine had run all night, burning through half a tank of gas to keep the cabin temperature tolerable. A sharp rapping sound startled me. I turned my head. My mother, Brenda, stood outside the driver's side window. She wore a full-length mink coat and dark sunglasses. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the frosted glass. I rolled the window down a few inches. The bitter morning air rushed in. "Sleeping in the car?" Anaya Brenda asked. Her tone was a mixture of disdain and profound inconvenience. She did not ask why the cabin was freezing. She did not ask if Leo was warm. "The heater is acting up, Mom," I replied. I kept my expression passive, hiding the inferno raging behind my eyes. "Well, Thomas will get a technician out to look at it eventually," she sighed, waving her gloved hand dismissively. "But I have more pressing matters. The charity board finalized the guest list for the Christmas Eve dinner. We are hosting 27 people. It is going to be our most important event of the year." She leaned slightly closer to the cracked window, lowering her sunglasses to peer at me. "Your father invited the mega developer," Brenda whispered, her voice thick with conspiratorial excitement. "The man who is going to buy the ridge. We need to impress him. We need everything flawless. I need you to cater the dinner, prep, serve, and clean up." I stared at her. She was asking the daughter she had forced to sleep in a freezing car to serve hors d'oeuvres to the man buying the dirt beneath her tires. "I cannot afford to take a night off from the agency, Mom," I lied, my voice flat. "I need the hours." Brenda scoffed. The sound was sharp, impatient. "Consider this, paying off your debt to the family, Anaya," she demanded. "Your father lets you live back here for a fraction of market rate. The least you can do is help secure this deal for our future. You will wear the black apron. You will stay in the kitchen unless you are serving. You will earn your keep." I looked at my mother. I looked at the mink coat funded by my father's hardware stores. I thought about the $3.2 million sitting in my corporate account. I thought about the $6,000 a month townhome I had just leased. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was predatory. It was the smile of a hunter watching a target walk willingly into a snare. "Of course, Mom," I said. My voice was dangerously smooth. "I will cater the dinner. I will wear the black apron. I will make sure the developer gets exactly what he deserves." Brenda nodded, satisfied that her authority remained absolute. She turned and walked back toward the massive stone lodge, her boots leaving deep tracks in the fresh snow. I rolled the window up. I leaned my head back against the headrest. The stage was set. My parents were throwing a lavish banquet to impress the very man who paid my company nearly $500,000 a year to protect his compound. They were inviting my biggest client to a dinner where they planned to humiliate me. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I picked it up. It was a secure text message on the encrypted client line. The sender ID read, "Julian Sterling." I opened the message. The text was brief, efficient, and utterly devastating to the Phillips family master plan. "Anaya," the message read, "the perimeter security on the compound looks excellent. I am flying into Jackson on the 23rd. I accepted a dinner invitation at the Phillips Lodge for Christmas Eve. Let us see if this stubborn local coalition breaks when I press them in their own dining room." I stared at the glowing screen. The dramatic irony was no longer just a secret. It was a loaded weapon. Julian Sterling was walking into my parents' dining room, expecting to intimidate a local hardware store owner. My father was expecting to charm a faceless corporate buyer. Neither of them knew that the woman serving the champagne held the keys to both of their empires. The month of December in Jackson Hole operates on two distinct frequencies. For the tourists and the casual wealthy, it is a postcard of twinkling lights and engineered cheer. For the service sector, it is a grueling marathon of logistics and survival. For me, it was the final countdown to an execution. I spent the weeks leading up to Christmas Eve living a dual existence. By day, I operated out of the Idaho warehouse, directing snow removal fleets, emergency plumbing teams, and holiday decoration crews for 14 luxury estates. By night, I returned to the freezing Honda Civic, parked behind the pine trees, bundling Leo in wool blankets and burning gasoline to keep frostbite at bay. The physical toll was heavy, but the mental clarity was absolute. The decoy cabin remained frozen and untouched. Thomas assumed his cruel siege was working. He assumed he was starving a peasant out of his backyard. He had no idea he was radicalizing a CEO. During the second week of December, a new variable entered the board. I received an email on my encrypted corporate server. The sender was a senior editor at the Wyoming Business Report, the premier financial publication in the state. Ms. Phillips, the email read, "Your firm, Apex Alpine Management, has been nominated anonymously by 3 separate high-net-worth clients for our annual Vanguard Award. Your rapid market acquisition in the Jackson Valley is unprecedented. We insist on featuring you on the cover of our upcoming January issue, highlighting the top entrepreneurs under 35. I stared at the screen. The timing was a staggering stroke of chaotic luck. The publication was read by every developer, politician, and bank manager in the region. A cover feature would obliterate the shadow status of Apex Alpine. It would strip away my anonymity and broadcast my empire to the entire state. If Thomas saw that magazine before his land deal closed, he would pivot his attack. He would realize his eviction strategy was useless and switch to litigation, attempting to claim my revenue as a product of his residential property. I needed to control the release of the information. I needed the detonation to occur on my exact schedule. I replied to the editor, agreeing to the interview and the photo shoot on one non-negotiable condition. The physical magazine issues could not drop on local newsstands or be mailed to subscribers until the morning of December 24th. Christmas Eve. The editor, eager for the exclusive story, agreed to the embargo. The photo shoot took place at Aunt Sylvia's nursery. The photographer set up lighting screens amidst the rows of winter-dormant evergreens. I did not wear jeans and a work shirt. I wore a sharp, tailored, charcoal gray power suit. The cut was precise, the fabric expensive. I stood with my arms crossed, projecting cold, unyielding authority. The camera flashed, capturing the image of a woman who commanded millions. It was a stark, violent contrast to the costume I packed in my duffel bag 2 days later. The morning of Christmas Eve arrived with a heavy blanket of fresh snow and a sky the color of crushed slate. The temperature hovered in the single digits. I left Leo at the new luxury townhome with a trusted private nanny I had hired through my agency. The townhome was warm, secure, and entirely disconnected from the Phillips family name. I drove the Honda Civic back to the main lodge, parking it in its designated hidden spot behind the garage. I walked into the massive kitchen of the lodge through the service entrance. The room was a whirlwind of manic preparation. Silver platters were stacked on the granite islands. Crates of imported wine sat near the industrial refrigerator. I reached into my bag and pulled out the plain, black catering apron. The fabric felt coarse, cheap. I tied the strings behind my back, feeling the familiar weight of subjugation settle over my shoulders. I was stepping back into the role my parents had written for me. Thomas stormed into the kitchen. He wore a tuxedo, holding a clipboard and a radio. He looked less like a host and more like a general preparing for a critical assault. "Anaya," he barked, not offering a greeting. "The developer, Julian Sterling, is arriving at 7 sharp. He is bringing his chief legal counsel. This is not a social call. This is a boardroom negotiation disguised as a dinner party. Everything must be flawless. He pointed the radio antenna at my chest. "You do not speak to him," Thomas commanded, his voice dripping with condescension. "You do not make eye contact. You refill the glasses, you clear the plates, and you remain invisible. If you drop a fork, if you pour the wrong wine, if you embarrass me tonight, I swear I will have the local sheriff drag you out of that cabin on Christmas morning." I looked at the man who had frozen his own grandson. I looked at the panicked sweat beading on his forehead. He was terrified. He was desperate for the $50 million payout to validate his entire existence. "I will be completely invisible, Dad," I said, my voice soft, compliant, and utterly hollow. "I will serve him exactly what he asks for." Thomas grunted, turning on his heel and marching back out to the dining room to inspect the floral arrangements. I spent the next 4 hours prepping the hors d'oeuvres, slicing imported cheeses, and polishing the crystal stemware. The physical labor was mindless, allowing my brain to run the final calculations of the trap. Derek arrived at 6 o'clock with Harper. He strutted into the kitchen to grab a bottle of sparkling water. He wore a custom-tailored suit, trying desperately to look like a man who was not currently facing foreclosure. He saw me wearing the black apron, wiping down a stainless steel prep station. Derek sneered. The fear he displayed in the bank parking lot was replaced by a smug, false confidence, now that he was back within the walls of my father's fortress. "Back where you belong, Anaya." Derek mocked, leaning against the counter. "I guess the little corporate address trick did not save you from having to scrub the pots. Make sure my water glass stays full tonight. I am going to be doing some heavy networking with the developer." I did not stop wiping the counter. I did not look up. "Your glass will be full, Derek," I replied, my tone dangerously quiet. "Enjoy the water. It might be the only thing the bank does not repossess next week." Derek's sneer faltered, his jaw tightening with renewed anxiety. He spun around and practically ran out of the kitchen, escaping the truth he could not outrun. Harper slipped into the kitchen a few moments later. She looked pale, exhausted. The strain of the facade was breaking her down cell by cell. She looked at me in the apron and offered a weak, apologetic smile. She did not know about the freezing cabin. She did not know about the extortion. She only knew she was drowning, and I was the only person who had thrown her a life raft. "Thank you again for the check," Harper whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ovens. "I paid the power company. I do not know how I am going to survive tonight, Anaya. Derek is planning to pitch the developer a wealth management strategy to try and secure a job. It is going to be a disaster." "Just breathe, Harper," I advised, placing a hand on her trembling shoulder. "The night is going to end very differently than Derek thinks." At 6:45, the guests began to arrive. The heavy oak front door opened and closed, admitting local politicians, wealthy neighbors, and the elite members of the Commerce Board. The lodge filled with the sound of expensive coats rustling and the low murmur of high-stakes conversation. I strapped a silver tray of champagne flutes to my forearm and pushed through the swinging kitchen doors into the lion's den. The dining room was blindingly bright, illuminated by a massive crystal chandelier. My mother Brenda held court near the fireplace, laughing loudly at a joke told by the zoning commissioner. Thomas worked the room, shaking hands, gripping shoulders, securing his alliances, before the main target arrived. I moved silently through the crowd, a black-clad ghost, offering crystal glasses to people who looked right through me. At exactly 7 o'clock, the chime of the front doorbell echoed through the foyer. The sound was sharp, cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. The conversations in the room dipped noticeably. The local elites turned their heads toward the entryway. Thomas practically sprinted past me, nearly knocking the tray from my hand, to reach the door. The heavy wood swung open. The Wyoming wind rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and frozen earth. Julian Sterling stepped over the threshold. The trap was officially set. The players were all on the board. The clinking glass was only hours away. Julian Sterling did not enter a room, he claimed it. He stepped into the foyer of the Phillips Lodge, bringing the freezing Wyoming air with him. He wore a dark, unstructured suit that projected wealth without trying. He did not carry a gift. He did not offer a wide, polite smile. He scanned the grand room, assessing the architecture, the art, and the 27 guests with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to buying whatever he was looking at. Thomas descended upon him instantly. My father moved with a frantic, sycophantic energy. He thrust his hand out, pumping Julian's arm with excessive vigor. "Julian, welcome, Thomas," boomed his voice, echoing slightly over the quieted crowd. "We are honored you could join us tonight. The entire coalition has been looking forward to this evening." Julian retrieved his hand. He offered a tight, non-committal nod. "Thomas," Julian replied. His voice was smooth, a low baritone that commanded immediate silence from the surrounding politicians and developers. "A busy night for a negotiation. Let us see if the hospitality matches the asking price for the ridge." Thomas laughed, a loud, nervous sound. He guided Julian away from the foyer, steering him directly toward the swinging kitchen doors where the bar was stationed. I was standing near the ice buckets holding a fresh tray of champagne flutes. I wore the black catering apron, my hair pulled back tightly. I kept my posture submissive, my eyes focused downward on the polished granite counter. Thomas burst through the swinging doors with Julian trailing closely behind. "Let me get you a proper drink, Julian," Thomas insisted, reaching over the counter to grab a bottle of expensive single malt scotch. As my father lunged forward, his shoulder slammed heavily into my arm. The impact was deliberate, careless. It forced me to stumble backward against the heavy stainless steel refrigerator. The silver tray tilted precariously, but I managed to stabilize the crystal glasses before they shattered. "Watch your step," Thomas barked, glaring at me with raw, unfiltered contempt. He turned immediately back to Julian, pasting the obsequious smile back on his face. "Apologies, Julian. The hired help tonight is incredibly clumsy. Good staff is impossible to find in this valley." I did not rub my bruised arm. I righted the tray and slowly raised my eyes. Julian Sterling stood 3 feet away. He held his scotch glass halfway to his chest. He looked at my father, who was busy polishing a smudge off a tumbler. Then Julian shifted his gaze to me. The recognition was instantaneous. The flint-colored eyes widened for a fraction of a second before narrowing into a sharp, focused intensity. Julian looked at the plain black apron. He looked at my bruised arm. He looked back at my father, who was blissfully unaware that he had just physically assaulted the CEO of the shadow company managing Julian's $40 million fortress. The silence between Julian and myself was electric. It hummed with sudden, terrifying clarity. Julian Sterling understood the board instantly. He saw the structural abuse, the forced poverty, the arrogant delusion of Thomas Phillips. He realized the woman who had executed an impossible emergency mitigation at his compound was standing in a freezing kitchen, being treated like livestock by the very man trying to squeeze him for $50 million. Julian did not say a word. He did not expose me. He simply tilted his chin down, a microscopic, deliberate nod. It was an acknowledgement of war. "The staff seems perfectly adequate," Thomas Julian said, his tone suddenly coated in absolute frost. He took the scotch glass from my father, refusing to break eye contact with me. "In my experience, when an operation fails, it is rarely the fault of the workers. It is usually a failure of leadership." Thomas blinked, the insult flying entirely over his head. He chuckled nervously, assuming Julian was making a broad corporate observation. "Exactly," Julian Thomas agreed eagerly. "Leadership is everything. Come, let me introduce you to the zoning commissioner. He is very eager to discuss the permits for your eco-resort." Thomas practically dragged Julian back out into the main dining room. I leaned against the refrigerator. My pulse thrummed a heavy, rhythmic beat against my ribs. The worlds were colliding. The parallel tracks of the Maid and the CEO were converging at blinding speed. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt difficult to pull oxygen into my lungs. I pushed back out into the dining room carrying the tray. I needed to monitor the shifting dynamics. I needed to watch the trap tighten. The 27 guests had congregated around the massive fireplace. Julian stood at the center, holding his scotch, projecting a cold, impenetrable barrier. The local politicians circled him like pilot fish, offering empty platitudes and fishing for development details. Julian answered in monosyllables, offering nothing. Then Derek made his move. The unemployed, bankrupt wealth manager saw the billionaire developer as a final, desperate lottery ticket. Derek pushed his way through the crowd of councilmen clutching a glass of sparkling water. He approached Julian with the aggressive, unearned swagger of a man who believed his leased Porsche actually meant something. Julian Derek announced stepping directly into the billionaire's personal space. He offered his hand. Derek Lawson, Senior Wealth Management. I handle the portfolios for several key players in the Valley. Julian looked at Derek's extended hand. He did not take it. He took a slow sip of his scotch. "Is that so?" Julian murmured, his eyes flicking over Derek's custom suit, assessing the cheap desperation radiating from the fabric. "Absolutely," Derek pressed on, oblivious to the social execution happening in real time. He dropped his hand, attempting to recover his momentum. "In fact, I've been analyzing the capital deployment strategies for your proposed eco-resort. You are going to need localized, aggressive wealth structuring to mitigate the regional tax burdens. I have a few disruptive models I would love to pitch you. We could set up a meeting next week." Harper stood near the edge of the crowd watching her husband self-destruct. She covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with mortification. Julian looked at Derek. The silence stretched, dragging on for an agonizing 10 seconds. The surrounding politicians stopped talking, turning to watch the slaughter. "Mr. Lawson," Julian finally said. His voice was quiet, but the absolute disdain in his tone cut through the room like a surgical scalpel. "I do not take unsolicited financial advice at dinner parties, and I certainly do not take it from men who use the word disruptive outside of a boardroom. Excuse me." Julian stepped around Derek, treating him like a piece of inconvenient furniture. Derek stood frozen in the center of the room. The local elites, the men he had spent years trying to impress, witnessed his total public emasculation. The smug, arrogant facade cracked, shattering into 1,000 irrecoverable pieces. He looked across the room, catching my eye. I stood near the dining table holding my silver tray. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just offered him a blank, steady stare, confirming what he already knew. He was a fraud, and the entire room had just figured it out. Derek turned and practically fled toward the hallway, escaping the humiliating whispers beginning to ripple through the crowd. The social hierarchy of the Phillips Lodge was rapidly deteriorating. Thomas was sweating through his tuxedo. Derek was exposed as a desperate clown. Harper was trembling near the curtains. And Julian Sterling, the man who held the fate of the $50 million coalition in his hands, stood quietly watching the chaos unfold, waiting for the spark that would ignite the powder keg. "Dinner is served," my mother Brenda announced, her voice shrill, tight with anxiety. The 27 guests moved toward the sprawling mahogany table. The seating arrangement was meticulously designed to place Julian directly in the center, flanked by Thomas and the most influential politicians. Harper sat near the far end, looking like a hostage. Derek sat beside her, his face flushed a dark, angry red. I moved around the table, serving the heavy plates of roasted tenderloin and winter root vegetables. I poured the expensive Cabernet. I cleared the empty salad bowls. I remained the invisible mechanism keeping the illusion running. The meal progressed in a state of suffocating tension. The conversation was strained, forced. Julian deflected every attempt Thomas made to discuss the land sale, returning the topic to the weather or the quality of the imported beef. Thomas was growing frantic, the $50 million payday slipping further out of his grasp with every passing minute. As the dessert plates were cleared away, Brenda decided it was time to deploy her ultimate weapon. She believed her family image was the key to sealing the deal. She needed to present the Phillips dynasty as the pinnacle of success and stability. Brenda stood up at the head of the table. She picked up a silver dessert spoon. She tapped the spoon against her crystal wine glass. The sharp ringing sound echoed through the dining room, slicing through the low hum of nervous conversation. The 27 guests stopped talking. They turned their attention to the woman in the emerald silk blouse. The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. I stood in the shadows near the kitchen door, my black apron tied tightly around my waist. My heart pounded a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. It was time for the toast. It was time for the execution to begin. The sharp ring of silver against crystal demanded absolute attention. The 27 guests shifted in their high-backed chairs, turning toward my mother. Brenda stood at the head of the mahogany table, projecting the polished glow of a matriarch presiding over an empire. I stood motionless near the swinging kitchen doors. The heavy silver tray rested flat against my palm. To family, Brenda began her voice, carrying that theatrical warmth she reserved exclusively for audiences. We are so blessed this year. Thomas and I have worked hard to build a foundation here in Jackson, but our true legacy, our greatest pride, becomes clear when we look at our girls. She extended an elegant hand toward the far side of the table. Harper sat rigid, staring at her half-empty wine glass. One daughter, my mother announced, ensuring the local councilmen and developers were hanging on every word, is a brilliant, board-certified doctor. The polite applause pattered through the room. Derek, sitting next to Harper, puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim a fraction of the dignity he had lost earlier. He needed the validation. He needed the room to remember he was attached to the golden child. Then Brenda turned her gaze to me. The theatrical warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating edge. She was using me as the dark, contrasting background to make her perfect daughter shine brighter. And the other Brenda paused, offering that soft, performed sigh. Well, the other is a maid, but at least our floors are spotless. The laughter bloomed exactly as she had orchestrated it. It started with my father's deep, chesty chuckle at the opposite end of the table. It rippled through the zoning commissioner and washed over the wives of the wealthy neighbors. It was the sound of a private club closing its doors on an outsider. I felt the small tug on my black apron. Leo stood beside me, his brow furrowed in confusion. The noise of 27 adults laughing at his mother confused him. It scared him. "Mommy," he whispered, his small voice cutting through the noise in my ears. "Is being a maid bad?" I placed my hand on his head. I looked at the sea of amused faces. I looked past Harper, staring at her lap. I looked past my father, grinning like a king who had just secured his crown. I looked at Julian Sterling. He sat perfectly still, holding his scotch, his eyes locked onto mine. The microscopic nod he gave me earlier echoed in the silence of my own mind. I did not retreat into the kitchen. I did not drop the silver tray. I set the tray down slowly, deliberately, onto the granite counter behind me. The heavy metallic clatter snapped through the fading laughter. The room quieted slightly. Several guests turned to look at the swinging doors, expecting me to disappear. I reached behind my back. I untied the strings of the coarse black catering apron. I pulled the fabric over my head. I did not throw it. I folded it neatly in half. Then I draped it over the back of the nearest empty dining chair. I stepped fully into the light of the massive crystal chandelier. I stood tall, my posture shedding the submissive curve I had worn all evening. The dining room fell into a sudden, heavy silence. The transition from background noise to active participant jarred the 27 guests. Brenda frowned, her manicured fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass. Anaya Thomas barked his voice a low, warning growl. "Get back in the kitchen, now." I ignored him. I looked down at my 6-year-old son. "No, Leo," I said. My voice was calm, carrying clearly across the silent expanse of the mahogany table. Being a maid is not bad. Honest, hard work is how you survive when the people who are supposed to protect you decide to freeze you out. I stroked his hair one last time before stepping forward, pulling the attention of every person in the room squarely onto myself. My mother is right. I continued turning my gaze to the 27 guests. I started out cleaning vacation rentals for $18 an hour. I scrubbed toilets. I polished floors. I did it because my father charged me $1,200 a month to live in an uninsulated shack in his backyard, while he controlled the heating oil from his smartphone. A collective intake of breath swept through the table. The wife of the zoning commissioner covered her mouth. Thomas half rose from his chair, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. "But I did not stop at scrubbing floors," I stated, keeping my voice ruthlessly steady. "I realize that the billionaires who own those mansions do not need maids. They need invisible, ruthless efficiency. They need a fortress. So I built one." I looked directly at my mother. The polished glow of the matriarch was cracking, rapidly replaced by stark, bewildered terror. "I am the founder and sole principal owner of Apex Alpine Management," I announced. The name of the shadow company hung in the air. The local developers at the table recognized the name instantly. The hushed whispers broke out like dry brush catching fire. "I operate a fleet of unmarked commercial vehicles." I continued, refusing to let the noise overpower me. "I command dedicated teams of specialized contractors. I currently hold 14 active elite retainers across the North Ridge. My projected gross revenue for this fiscal year is $3.2 million. The silence returned, absolute and suffocating. $3.2 million. The number was a physical weight dropping onto the center of the table. I turned my attention to Harper. The golden child sat paralyzed, her eyes wide with shock. I could expose her right now. I could announce that she was $300,000 in debt. I could tell the room that the check keeping her lights on tonight was drawn from my corporate operating account. I could destroy the perfect image my mother had just toasted. But I looked at the dark circles under Harper's eyes. I looked at the way she shrank away from Derek. I did not need to ruin her to win. "Titles do not equal happiness," I said softly, speaking directly to my sister. "A medical degree does not guarantee a safe home. I know you are doing the best you can, Harper, and I know the pressure of this table is suffocating. You do not have to pretend anymore." Harper let out a jagged, choked sob. The grace I offered her was sharper than any blade. It confirmed her secret pain without broadcasting the humiliating details to the town gossips. "This is insane," Thomas roared, shattering the fragile moment. He stood up fully, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. His face was a mottled purple rage, contorting his features into something ugly and desperate. "She is lying," Thomas shouted, pointing a thick, shaking finger at me. "She is a delusional, struggling maid who cannot even pay her rent on time. She is having a mental breakdown. Do not listen to a word of this." He turned frantically toward the center of the table, seeking the ultimate authority to validate his narrative. He looked at Julian Sterling. "Julian, I apologize." Thomas pleaded, the sycophantic desperation returning in full force. "She is clearly unwell. We have been trying to manage her episodes privately. I will have security remove her from the property immediately so we can continue our negotiations. Please do not let this absurd fantasy disrupt the Ridge deal." I stood perfectly still. I did not argue with my father. I did not scream my defense. I simply watched the billionaire tech developer slowly, deliberately set his scotch glass down on the mahogany table. Julian Sterling did not look at Thomas. He did not look at the frantic developers or the shocked politicians. He looked at me. And the executioner raised his axe. Julian Sterling stood up. He did not rush the motion. He moved with the slow, deliberate gravity of a man who owned the airspace in whatever room he occupied. The frantic energy radiating from Thomas hit the billionaire's calm exterior and shattered like cheap glass. The 27 guests at the mahogany table held their collective breath. The local politicians, the zoning commissioner, the wealthy wives, they all watched Julian, waiting for the Titan to restore order. They expected him to wave his hand, have the hysterical maid removed, and return to the high-stakes negotiation of the $50 million Ridge deal. Julian looked at Thomas, whose face was still mottled purple with rage. Then he turned his head and looked at me. "She is not lying," Thomas Julian stated. His voice was not raised, but it carried a lethal acoustic weight that pinned every person to their chair. Thomas blinked. The frantic waving of his hands ceased. "What?" Thomas stammered, the single word slipping out weak and confused. "I said she is not lying," Julian repeated. He buttoned his suit jacket, adjusting his cuffs with meticulous precision. "Anaya Phillips is the principal owner of Apex Alpine Management. I know this because she manages my entire local portfolio. That includes the $40 million compound perched directly above this valley." A collective gasp swept through the dining room. The wife of the local councilman grabbed her husband's arm. The zoning commissioner stared at me, his jaw slack. The shadow company, the invisible operation that had taken over the North Ridge, was standing in front of them, wearing jeans and a turtleneck, having just discarded a catering apron. "Last month, my main water lines ruptured hours before a critical fundraising gala." Julian continued addressing the room as if delivering a boardroom post-mortem. "The previous management company informed me it was impossible to mitigate the damage. Anaya deployed a strike team and had the estate sanitized, dry, and operational in under 2 hours. She is arguably the most capable logistical operator in this state." I watched my mother. Brenda sat frozen at the head of the table. The emerald silk blouse suddenly looked costume-like, absurd. The matriarchal glow was entirely extinguished. She was staring at the daughter she had mocked for 4 years, realizing she had been forcing a millionaire CEO to scrub her floors. "Julian, please," Thomas interrupted, his voice desperate, reeking of sheer panic. "This is a family matter. We can discuss my daughter's employment later. We need to finalize the terms for the Ridge Block. The coalition is ready to sign." Julian turned his flint-colored eyes back to Thomas. The frost in his gaze dropped to absolute zero. "There will be no signatures, Thomas," Julian said. "The Ridge deal is dead." The words hung in the air, a brutal final verdict. "What do you mean, dead?" Thomas grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white. "We have an agreement. The land surveys are done. We negotiated the price in good faith." "You do not know the meaning of good faith," Julian countered, his tone sharpening into a blade. "My legal team pulled the federal land disclosures you filed last week regarding this property. You claimed the secondary structure, the hunting cabin on the rear parcel, was entirely vacant. You certified, under penalty of perjury, that there were no encumbrances or tenants." Thomas swallowed hard, a thick, visible motion in his throat. "It is vacant," Thomas lied, his voice cracking. "She was just staying there temporarily. We are handling the transition." "Do not insult my intelligence," Julian sneered. "I ran a background check on Apex Alpine before signing my retainer. I know where her initial operating address was registered. I know she has been living in that uninsulated shack with a child for 4 years. And I know what you did when you thought she was becoming a liability to this sale." Julian took a step toward Thomas, dominating the physical space. "You cut the heating oil to that cabin in the middle of November," Julian stated, his voice ringing clear and damning across the silent dining room. "You tried to freeze your own daughter and your 6-year-old grandson out of your backyard just to ensure you could present a clean property survey." A horrified murmur ripped through the guests. The local politicians, the men who attended Rotary Club meetings with my father, stared at him in utter disgust. The polished, respectable facade of Thomas Phillips was peeled back, revealing a monster. "I do not do business with liars," Julian declared, delivering the final, fatal blow. "I do not negotiate with men who commit federal disclosure fraud. And I certainly do not write $50 million checks to men who try to freeze their own grandchildren. The eco-resort project is moving to the South Valley. You and your coalition get nothing." The sound of shattering glass punctuated the sentence. Brenda had dropped her crystal wine glass. It smashed against the expensive hardwood floor, red wine bleeding across the pristine surface like a wound. She did not move to clean it up. She sat paralyzed, staring at the ruin of her social empire. Derek, sitting near the end of the table, buried his face in his hands. He was bankrupt. His leased Porsche was days away from repossession, and his final, desperate hope of securing a job with the mega developer was annihilated by the very man he had tried to impress. Thomas collapsed backward into his high-backed chair. The fight completely left his body. He looked small, old, and entirely broken. He had prioritized a payout over his family, and in the end, he lost both. Julian Sterling did not offer a closing pleasantry. He did not say goodbye to the hosts. He simply turned, walked out of the dining room, and exited the lodge, leaving the front door wide open to the freezing Wyoming night. The 27 guests sat in absolute, stunned silence. No one spoke. No one reached for their silverware. They were trapped in the wreckage of a dynasty they had come to celebrate. I looked at the mahogany table. I looked at the ruined faces of my parents. I did not feel a rush of triumphant joy. I did not feel the need to gloat or scream or throw the black apron in their faces. I felt clean. The suffocating weight of their expectations, their cruelty, their constant demand for my subjugation had finally lifted. I turned away from the table. I walked over to the swinging kitchen doors. I knelt down and scooped Leo into my arms. He buried his face in my neck, wrapping his arms tightly around me. I carried my son through the dining room, walking past the frozen politicians and the terrified wealthy wives. I walked past Harper, who was openly weeping, her tears ruining her pristine makeup. I walked past Thomas, staring blankly at the wall. I stepped out of the dining room into the grand foyer. The heavy oak front door was still open, letting the biting wind swirl into the overheated house. I walked out onto the stone porch. The cold air hit my face, sharp and invigorating. The nightmare was over. The theater had burned down exactly as I promised. But as I looked down the long, circular driveway toward the main road, I realized the execution was not entirely finished. The final nail in the coffin of the Phillips family legacy was waiting out in the snow. The Wyoming night was bitterly cold, but it felt like a baptism. I stood on the stone porch of the main lodge, holding Leo securely against my chest. The wind whipped through the towering pine trees, carrying the sharp scent of impending snow. I looked down the sweeping, circular driveway. The 27 luxury vehicles belonging to the local elite were parked in a meticulous curve. Mercedes SUVs, Range Rovers, and sleek Audis gleamed under the amber glow of the property's security lights. A figure emerged from the shadows near the gated entrance. Aunt Sylvia walked slowly up the driveway. She wore her heavy Carhartt jacket and thick work boots, entirely unbothered by the freezing temperature. She carried a large canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder. She did not approach the porch. She moved with deliberate, methodical purpose among the parked luxury cars. I watched as Sylvia stopped at a black Range Rover belonging to the zoning commissioner. She reached into her canvas bag. She pulled out a glossy, thick magazine. She leaned over the hood and slid the publication firmly under the windshield wiper blade. She moved to the next car, an Audi sedan belonging to a prominent local developer. She repeated the action, reaching into the bag, extracting a magazine, sliding it under the wiper blade. She was distributing the detonators. The embargo had lifted. It was Christmas Eve. The January issue of the Wyoming Business Report was officially public. Sylvia finished placing the final magazine on the windshield of Derek's leased silver Porsche. She looked up at the stone porch, her eyes locking onto mine across the snowy expanse. She did not smile. She offered a slow, firm nod of profound respect. The outcast, the woman my mother had spent 2 decades trying to erase, had just delivered the final lethal blow to the Phillips family facade. The heavy oak door behind me groaned open. The mass exodus began. The dinner party had imploded with spectacular violence, and no one wanted to remain inside the blast radius. The local politicians, the developers, the wealthy neighbors flooded out of the lodge. They did not say their goodbyes. They did not retrieve their coats from the hall closet with any grace. They grabbed their belongings and practically ran down the stone steps, eager to escape the suffocating humiliation radiating from Thomas and Brenda. As the guests reached their vehicles, the frantic exodus ground to a sudden, halting stop. The zoning commissioner reached his Range Rover. He noticed the glossy magazine pinned against the glass. He pulled it free, frowning in confusion. The security lights illuminated the cover. I watched him stare at the glossy image. The confusion on his face morphed into absolute, stunned realization. Other guests reached their cars. They pulled the magazines from their windshields. The hushed, panicked whispers began to echo across the frozen driveway. On the cover, printed in crisp, bold lettering, was the headline, "The Shadow Empire of Jackson Hole." Beneath the text was a full-page, high-resolution photograph. It was me. I was wearing the tailored charcoal gray power suit, my arms crossed, my expression cold and unyielding. The subtitle read, "How Anaya Phillips Built a Multi-Million-Dollar Fortress in the Valley of Billionaires." The politicians and developers stood in the snow holding the undeniable proof of my reality in their gloved hands. They looked from the magazine cover up to the stone porch where I stood holding my son. They had spent the last 4 hours ignoring me. They had laughed at my mother's cruel toast. They had assumed I was the tragic, failed footnote of a powerful family. Now, they were holding financial documentation proving the woman holding the catering tray possessed more liquid capital and corporate influence than half the men in that driveway combined. The zoning commissioner did not look away. He offered a small, nervous tip of his head, acknowledging the catastrophic shift in the regional power dynamic. He got into his vehicle and sped away. The others followed suit. Engines roared to life, tires spinning against the icy pavement as the local elite fled the ruined property, clutching the magazines that would dominate the valley gossip circles for the next decade. Within 5 minutes, the driveway was empty. Only Derek's silver Porsche and my hidden Honda Civic remained. I turned to walk down the steps. I needed to get Leo to the warmth of the new townhome. The heavy oak door banged open again. Harper stumbled out onto the porch. She was not wearing her coat. She wore the thin designer dress, shivering violently in the sub-zero wind. Her perfect hair was a tangled mess. Black mascara streaked down her cheeks, tracking the path of fresh, relentless tears. "Anaya, wait," Harper cried out. Her voice was raspy, broken. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs. I turned back, adjusting Leo's weight in my arms. Harper descended the stone steps, her heels slipping dangerously on the ice. She practically collapsed into me, wrapping her arms around my shoulders, burying her face against the thick fabric of my winter coat. "I cannot go back inside," Harper sobbed, her whole body shaking against mine. "I cannot look at them. I cannot look at Derek. He is in the study, screaming at Dad, blaming him for losing the job with Julian. Dad is throwing scotch glasses against the wall. It is a nightmare, Anaya. It is a total nightmare." I held my sister. The golden child, the medical prodigy, was clinging to the Maid for survival. The lifelong rivalry, carefully cultivated and stoked by our mother over decades, dissolved instantly in the freezing Wyoming air. There was no competition anymore. There was only the shared trauma of surviving a house built on lies. "You do not have to go back inside Harper," I said, my voice soft, grounding. "You do not have to pretend anymore. The play is over." The audience left. Harper pulled back slightly, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. "I hate him," Anaya Harper whispered the truth, finally tearing free from her chest. "I hate Derek. I hate the debt. I hate my job. I hate this entire fake life. But I have nowhere to go. The bank is going to take the house next week. I have absolutely nothing." I reached into my coat pocket. I pulled out a heavy brass key attached to a simple leather fob. "I leased a townhome in town," I said, pressing the key into her trembling hand. 3 bedrooms, radiant heating. There is a guest room on the 2nd floor. It is empty. You can stay as long as you need to figure things out. Harper stared at the key. It was a piece of brass, but it represented total liberation. "You would do that for me?" Harper asked, fresh tears spilling over her eyelashes. "After everything they did to you? After everything I let them do to you?" "You are my sister, Harper," I replied, my tone steady, absolute. They wanted us to fight for their approval because it kept us distracted. It kept us under their control. I am not playing their game anymore, and neither are you. Harper clutched the key against her chest. She nodded a fierce, desperate movement. She did not run back inside to pack a bag. She did not say goodbye to her bankrupt husband. She simply turned and walked across the snow toward my Honda Civic, sliding into the passenger seat, ready to leave the wreckage behind. I stood in the driveway for a long moment, holding my son, looking back at the massive stone lodge. The front door was still open. The grand foyer was brightly lit, but it looked hollow, vacant. Thomas stepped out onto the porch. He looked ruined. His tuxedo jacket was discarded. His tie hung loose around his neck. He stared out at the empty driveway. He saw the tracks of 27 departed vehicles. He saw his $50 million payday vanishing into the dark. He saw his youngest daughter leaving in a compact car, taking his golden child with her. Brenda appeared behind him. She clutched a shawl around her shoulders, her face pale and slack with shock. She looked out into the night, searching for the social empire she had spent her life cultivating. She found nothing but the howling wind. I did not wave. I did not yell a final triumphant insult. I simply turned my back on them. I secured Leo in his car seat. I climbed into the driver's seat, turning the ignition. The heater blasted warm air immediately. I put the car in gear and drove slowly down the long, winding driveway, leaving the Phillips compound for the last time. I watched the massive stone lodge shrink in the rearview mirror. Thomas and Brenda remained standing on the frozen porch, two tiny figures isolated in the center of their own destruction. They had spent 4 years trying to freeze me out of their world. They succeeded. I was entirely gone. But as the headlights cut through the falling snow, illuminating the road back to town, I realized the story did not end in the driveway. A dramatic exit is satisfying, but building a sustainable empire requires more than just walking away from the wreckage. I had secured my business, my child, and my sister. But the true test of power is what you build in the ashes of the cage that used to hold you. The scent of roasted sage and browned butter filled the warm air of the townhome. Outside the wide glass windows, the Wyoming winter raged. Snow swept across the valley floor, blanketing the streets of Jackson in pristine white. Inside, the radiant floor heating pushed a steady, comfortable warmth up through the hardwood. It was Thanksgiving Day, exactly 1 year after the Christmas Eve dinner that burned the Phillips family dynasty to the ground. I stood at the edge of my kitchen, pouring a glass of sparkling cider. I wore comfortable denim and an oversized knit sweater. There was no catering apron. There was no suffocating tension gripping my throat. I looked out into the dining room. The table was not a sprawling, intimidating slab of polished mahogany. It was a long, sturdy oak farmhouse table I had purchased from a local artisan. It was built for gathering, not for intimidating. Every seat was filled. Aunt Sylvia sat at the head, carving a golden turkey with the precise fluid motions of a woman who worked with her hands her entire life. Beside her sat Martinez, my lead plumber, and his wife. Across from them sat my corporate dispatcher, sharing a loud, genuine laugh with my landscaping foreman. I did not just invite my family. I invited the people who helped me build my fortress. They were the foundation of Apex Alpine. And then there was Harper. My sister sat near the center of the table. She looked unrecognizable from the trembling, hollow woman who had stumbled out into the snow a year ago. She wore a simple flannel shirt, her hair pulled into a messy knot. The designer dresses were gone. The expensive makeup hiding the dark circles of exhaustion was gone. Harper had finalized her divorce from Derek in early spring. The bank took the sprawling house, the luxury cars, and the suffocating debt. Derek moved out of state chasing another scheme, another illusion. Harper stayed. She moved out of my guest room after 3 months and signed a lease on a modest apartment near the hospital. She stepped down from the high-pressure cosmetic clinic and took a steady, rewarding position at a local pediatric urgent care. She traded the performance of a perfect life for the quiet peace of an honest one. I watched Harper pass a bowl of mashed potatoes to Martinez, her smile reaching all the way to her eyes. The lifelong rivalry our mother had carefully engineered to keep us fighting for scraps of approval was dead. We were no longer competitors on a rigged stage. We were sisters. The sound of small running feet drew my attention. Leo darted around the edge of the oak table carrying a basket of warm dinner rolls. He was 7 years old now. He wore a crisp button-down shirt and a grin that lit up the entire room. He handed a roll to Sylvia, who ruffled his hair, making him giggle. I leaned against the kitchen counter watching my son. He was happy. He was safe. He was entirely unburdened by the toxic legacy of his grandparents. He did not remember the freezing cabin. He did not know the sting of being the punchline at a holiday dinner. I had absorbed the poison, so he would never have to taste it. Breaking a generational curse does not require a dramatic speech. It just requires you to walk out the front door and never bring the darkness into your new home. The transition over the past year had been swift and brutal for the people left behind in the old house. In a town like Jackson Hole, social currency is the only currency that matters. When Julian Sterling pulled out of the $50 million eco-resort deal, the fallout was catastrophic for my father. The local coalition of neighbors the men Thomas had organized and promised a massive payday turned on him instantly. Thomas was exposed as a liability. The federal disclosure fraud regarding my cabin became an open secret among the local elite. People in high tax brackets protect their investments above all else, and Thomas had proven he was willing to jeopardize millions to satisfy a petty familial grudge. 2 weeks after Christmas, Thomas was asked to step down from the local Commerce Board. It was not a polite request. It was a quiet, forceful eviction from the halls of power. His hardware stores began losing the lucrative commercial supply contracts he had spent decades securing. The developers and contractors shifted their accounts to competitors, unwilling to associate with a man whose reputation was tainted by Julian Sterling's public disgust. Thomas Phillips became a ghost in his own town. He stopped attending the country club. He stopped hosting the lavish dinners. The 5,000-square-foot lodge became a silent tomb. My mother suffered a different kind of exile. Brenda had built her identity on the envy of the wealthy wives in her social circle. She thrived on being the ultimate authority on status. But the January issue of the Wyoming Business Report dismantled her authority permanently. The women she had sought to impress read the cover story. They read about the shadow empire I had built in the valley. They read about the extreme discretion and flawless execution of Apex Alpine Management. Wealthy people do not care about country club gossip when their own assets are on the line. They care about ruthless efficiency. By the end of February, nearly half of the women from Brenda's charity board had fired their existing property management companies. They called my corporate office in Idaho. They signed elite retainers with Apex Alpine, trusting my teams to protect their multi-million-dollar chalets. Brenda was forced to watch her closest friends hand over the keys to their estates to the daughter she had introduced as a maid. She became a pariah. The wives stopped inviting her to the charity luncheons because my presence in the valley rendered her previous arrogance unforgivable. She was isolated, trapped in a sprawling house with a disgraced husband, having traded her daughters for an illusion that evaporated in the snow. I did not seek out updates on my parents. I did not track their downfall with gleeful vindication. The details filtered back to me through the natural gossip of the valley, but I let them wash over me without attachment. True power is not watching your enemies suffer. True power is forgetting they exist because you are too busy tending to the garden you planted in their absence. I picked up my glass of cider and walked into the dining room. I took the empty seat at the head of the oak table, directly opposite Aunt Sylvia. The conversations paused. The faces turned toward me. There was no fear in their eyes. There was no expectation of a cruel joke or a cutting remark. There was only respect, warmth, and chosen loyalty. I raised my glass. To the people who show up when it is freezing, I said, my voice steady and clear. To the family we build and the doors we close. Thank you for sitting at this table. The glasses raised, clinking together in a chorus of genuine joy. Leo cheered, raising his cup of juice. Harper met my eyes, mouthing a silent, profound thank you. I took a sip of the cider, letting the sweet taste linger. If you are listening to this story right now, I want you to pause and look at your own life. Look at the people who demand a seat at your table. We are taught from a very young age that blood is an unbreakable contract. We are told to endure the disrespect, to swallow the insults, and to accept the cruel jokes, because family is supposed to be forever. We are conditioned to believe that setting a boundary makes us the villain. We are told that walking away is a sign of weakness. That is the lie they use to keep you in the cage. Setting a boundary is not a betrayal. It is survival. Refusing to let toxic people poison your air is the most profound act of self-love you can commit. You do not owe your success, your sanity, or your children to people who only value you when you are standing in their shadow. I spent years shrinking myself to fit into a room where I was never going to be respected. I scrubbed floors. I slept in a freezing car. I believed the narrative they wrote for me until the pain of staying became greater than the fear of leaving. The moment I stopped trying to prove my worth to people committed to misunderstanding me, my entire world expanded. I built a multi-million-dollar empire, not by fighting them, but by outgrowing them in the dark. You do not need to scream your truth at a mahogany table to win. You just need to quietly, relentlessly build your own fortress. You need to focus on the bricks, on the mortar, on the daily grind of securing your own independence. The people who mock your hustle today will be the same people begging for access to your empire tomorrow. You do not have to grant it. You hold the keys. If you are sitting at a table right now where you are the punchline, where your dreams are belittled and your worth is minimized, I have one question for you. What are you waiting for? The door is unlocked. The air outside is cold, but it is clean. You have the power to fold the apron, push back the chair, and step into the light. You have the ability to build a life so beautiful and secure that the people who hurt you become nothing more than a faint memory in the rearview mirror. Stand up, walk out, and start building. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever had to walk away from a toxic table to save yourself, I want to hear from you. Hit the like button to show your support for breaking generational curses. Drop a comment below and share the moment you finally realized your own worth. Let us build a community of people who refuse to stay in the shadows. And if you are ready to hear more stories about surviving, thriving, and reclaiming your power, make sure you subscribe to Pana Vengeance. We are just getting started. Thank you for listening. Keep building in the dark. Your time is coming.